אני הולך להשתין. אני הולך להשתין. להשתין. נו!
Match found.
אני מוכן לצאת די, זה מעצבן, די. די אבל, בשביל מה? למה אני לא עושה ככה וזהו? אין סיכוי, אני נדפק עם מישהו שאני לא אוהב. אחד, שתיים, אחד, שתיים, אחד, שתיים, אחד, שתיים. The zoom is here, the zoom is here. The zoom is here, the zoom is here. אחד, שתיים, אחד, שתיים. אחד, שתיים, אחד, שתיים. הלו. הלו. הלו, הלו, אוקיי. הלו. 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 הלו, אחת, שתיים, אחת, שתיים. הלו. 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 אוקיי. סבבה. שיהיה. אנחנו כבר בתוך המשחק. מה נשמע לי? כן, בטח שאני משחק בלון. כוס עמק עם זה, איי, שיט. עוד הפעם אני אעשה בעיות. תן לה כבשה בלדרך, יא גבר.
And the last
תעזור
thing they'll
לאחי.
see before they die. Lucky them.
לייב. ככה צ'ילינג, אין לי כוח לצעוק היום באמת.
Cutting through.
דבט. ברוכה הבאה.
Over here.
Go B, fast.
Spike planted.
איך קוראים לה? איך קוראים לך?
Buried.
שכחתי איך קוראים לה.
Cage triggered.
Last player standing.
פלט, אני פלט.
That killjoy's tech is everywhere. We're not at a science fair. Get rid of that shit.
ככה. מה זאת אומרת חמוד? זה רנקד.
Time to jump.
Hey.
יופי, הפלשתי את עצמי גם, באמת שאני פאקינג צוק עכשיו, יואו. אני חייב להתאפק.
Maybe tier 1.
Spike planted.
את אימורטל, אוקיי.
Here.
יודעת מה?
Last player standing.
אני בודק. רגע, יש לך משהו בערוץ...
As much as this world hurt me, it's mine, and I will kill to defend it.
צריך רק פורטנייט. לפחות, כאילו, מה שאני רואה, יש לך רק סרטון פורטנייט ביוטיוב שלך.
Cutting through.
איזה זלזול, לא, איזה זלזול. לא מזלזל.
Big waller.
אתה. משתמשת בקלף.
My portal broke.
Are they pushing B?
Yes.
Welcome to my world.
Backside top. Inside.
Time to jump.
סמם. רגע, הם מפה.
My ult ready. Enemy spotted B. Spike planted.
לא נראה לי יש לי טוויטר בכלל. רגע, what the fuck, נובר שאמרתי לעייף בשעות האלה. לא, את לא צריכה להראות לי, הכל טוב. זה מה שאני מתכוון להגיד.
Cage triggered.
One enemy remaining. Last player standing.
Operator.
אתה מוקד. Nice.
Don't rush me. They couldn't kill us.
את באמת אימורטל כאילו? רגע, אני בכלל יכול לשחק עם אימורטל? אם את באמת אימורטל?
Can you please fucking hold B like it's supposed to be hold?
Cutting
I'm
through.
tipping
They're
to
entering
B.
free,
No one is
They're
in B.
entering free.
No one is in B. I'm tipping to B.
Jump them.
They are so dead.
The fuck, איזה קבוצה.
Enemy A.
אוקיי.
I have camera Sawa. Wait. Watch out mid and two.
יש לך עוד משתמשים?
One enemy remaining.
אוקיי.
Sova, mate, can you
Wala,
kill the
he's
fucking
missing
robot
shot.
that's standing right in front of you, yeah?
They demand a fight. Who are we to disobey? Reloading.
סבבה. ככה המשחק הזה שערים.
And who's gonna play B now? Dude, you can't just rotate. We're not 5 pre-made. You can't do that.
Time to jump.
שמור, באמת שאין לי כוח, אני אפילו לא חושב. סתם עליתי לי לייב עכשיו.
B.
Spike planted.
היי יואו! הוא היה צריך למות, what the fuck? 100 on קולג'וי.
Backside.
Are you fucking retarded? What the fuck are you doing all on A?
Enemy down. Scanning ahead.
Close.
Get him,
One
get him.
window
Last
behind you,
player
Sova.
standing.
וואו.
Mater ti jebemo usta mrtvu. Mater ti jebemo usta retardiranu degeneriku jedan glup.
And I need a return.
Please report this piece of shit of Sova, yeah?
יאללה טוב.
Ti pička. I fuck your dead sister in mouth, Sova. I literally come in her fucking dirty pussy, yeah?
Time to jump.
שוט.
Here we go.
Does anyone have
תודה
fun?
לי. למה לא, לא, חשבתי על איזה טרול, בגלל זה אמרתי, קראתי לך בשם זכר.
Careful.
שיט,
One enemy remaining.
Here. Portal closed.
120
I
going B.
fuck your dead mother in the mouth, you know that, you piece of shit. Retarded piece of shit. French dog.
רגע, יכול להיות גם עכשיו.
Spike planted.
או שלא. Nice. You can hear me by the way, yes? Hello, I'm talking to you.
Take flight.
They didn't actually think that would work. Reloading.
משהו דברים.
What do you say, drone? Ready to stretch your wings?
I need this. My thanks.
איזה מפרק.
Sova, can you drop? Sova, can you drop, dude?
Can you drop that, dude?
Sova.
Cutting through.
Sova. Why?
You should run.
What the fuck?
Last player standing. Spike planted. Finished. My ult ready.
Nice time.
Yeah, bro. Because you're dog shit.
Yeah, I know.
Stay alive.
I'm very
I want
tired.
their life, not yours.
Why won't you drop, dude? What the fuck
You want
is
me to
wrong with
be better? Hey yo, I'm talking to you.
Is your Sova your friend, mate? Are you pre-made with him?
No.
Yeah, it is.
ויזיטה פורטלית שלנו טמטם קוקסין.
Careful now.
Welcome to my world.
Reloading.
Probably inside Viper and Killjoy in front.
Reloading.
One enemy remaining.
Your biggest mistake was that you pissed me off.
Please do not mistake my smile. I take this all very seriously.
Try not to die.
Enemy spotted me.
Spike down mid.
Time to jump.
Enemy spotted me.
Go mid, go.
One enemy
F1
remaining.
No.
You could be
Maybe two, maybe
city.
city.
Go B, go B.
Spike planted.
Give me a corpse. Where is everyone hiding?
Revealing area.
Last player standing. Clutch.
Dog shit.
If
Your
you are
mom
not
is dog
doing
shit,
well,
man.
Your mom
keep
dog
trying.
shit. Shut the
You
fuck up.
must keep up appearances.
Need a drop.
Time to jump.
They are so dead.
The hunt begins.
You.
They will cover.
איך עושים? יש לו 100 on breach.
Revealing area.
Away!
What? The fuck she where we're gonna TP there?
Enemy spotted A.
Both on A, both on A, both on A.
Spike planted. Last player standing.
Shock dart.
בואנה, הטמבל הזה לא רוצה לשחרר מהאבו.
One enemy remaining.
Kill him.
My ult is ready.
Nice.
Clutch.
Never give up.
Last round in the half.
Spend everything. Don't be cheap.
Cutting through.
And somebody guard too.
Hit them when they're not looking.
Ropes.
Enemy spotted A.
Bad luck. Both are close.
Spike down A. One enemy remaining.
פלן שיט.
Switching sides.
זה עמק, לא.
Can't be away for long. Let's end this quickly.
Are we going to get the spike?
Break them. Cutting their vision.
Cutting through.
לא נכון, הוא אשכרה התחבא. 60.
Taken out.
60 on Viper, he's very low. Go in. אתה לעזאזל עושה שם.
I have the spike.
Foolish.
Viper low, I'm saying again. Hey. He's low.
Last player standing.
איזה קוקסינל, לא שהוא פחדן. כולו השתין במכנסיים.
Stay alive. I want their life, not yours.
Embarrass them. Enemy spotted A. You disappoint.
Don't bait.
There they are.
Dead.
Mid one coming.
There.
Cover, safe.
One bridge. Minus 55 bridge. Fell down.
Enemy down.
One enemy
Anyone
remaining.
else?
Behind.
Cave.
Main.
Cave.
Here.
Last player standing.
What the fuck? אחי. מה זה היה עכשיו?
Clutch.
איזה גול נפש, אחי, מה קרה פה עכשיו?
Please not.
לא יודע שזה
mistake
מסיח
my
את הדעת
smile.
הדבר
I take this
הצהוב
all
הזה.
very
אז
seriously.
אין, זה מראה את הפאקינג עקבות שלו. יורה לזה במקום עליו, what the fuck? כל הרואה את זה. היי. לא כלי גרוע. עייף. שק.
Time to jump.
Deploying drone.
Welcome to my world.
Enemy marked.
Spike down B.
Enemy B.
Last player standing.
Deep breaths, everyone. Your hearts are pounding.
Spike.
Top mid. W. Pushing from behind. Every. B is clear.
Nice. There is another one.
Probably cave.
Last player standing.
באמא שלך, נו, באמא שלך, למה דווקא אני והטיימינגים האלה? זה טיימינג, איך?
Let's strike first. It's better than having to strike back.
There.
I have retrieved the spike.
Scanning ahead.
Reload.
Minus 80.
And the pyramid.
Reload.
Our spike carrier is dead.
Spike down mid. Last player
לא יכול
standing.
לעשות כלום, אני הולך לפה, בן זונה נמצא שם. מה זה? לא פורצים גם כלום, הם סתם נעמדים במידל ושום דבר. שום כלום.
I'll pick them apart. You clean up
בוא
whatever's
נעשה
left.
משהו, אני לא מבין. מה אתם נעמדים באמצע?
I fuck your dead sister in the ass, Sova.
I will find you.
Welcome to my world.
Perfect. Shot dart.
Spike down mid.
How stupid can you be, dude?
Last player standing.
You run until the middle of the site, then you walk.
You're talking about me?
Yeah.
Yeah, talking about you.
Shut the fuck up, you hoe. Shut the
Shut
fuck
the
up.
fuck
Shut
up.
the fuck
Oh,
up.
but shut the fuck up.
Shut
Let
the
the
fuck up.
fucking speak English, bro.
Deleted my ult.
Where are
You
you
can suck
from? Uganda?
my dick. You can suck my dick.
Suck my dick.
Match
You can
point.
suck my dick.
my dick.
Yeah, that's
Suck
the only way you can
my
say it, right?
dick.
Yeah. Okay.
אז אתה רוצה שנדבר איתך בעברית? אוקיי, יא בן זונה מטומטם קוקסינלי, אוכל בתחת, מה אתה מדבר? מה אתה מדבר? מה
Ah, yeah,
אתה
great.
יא קוקסינלי?
That just proves you're a fucking gypsy, dude. Fuck off.
איך אתה קוקסינלי המטומטם, יא אוכל בתחת, יא מפגר.
Go fuck
Fuck
some
it,
Muslims.
Suck some dick,
Yeah, I'm so
some
scared
black
you maybe
cock,
blow us
some
up, yeah.
big black cock, you bitch.
Bitch.
יש לי כוח אליהם לדבר.
They are so dead.
Dead.
Haha, you.
I am the
Begins.
You dead.
Cutting through.
חלאס.
Spike down mid.
Neutralized.
מה?
Revealing area.
Last player standing.
Fire in the hole!
30 seconds left.
GG,
Defenders
fuck all of you, suck my
Go
dick,
fuck you,
suck my
go
dick,
fuck
suck my
your dead
dick, suck my
sister,
dick.
retard.
Fuck your dead sister, you son of a bitch. עליי. זה לא רוצה להתחיל. מה זה הקור הזה? What the fuck? איזה חונק זה, יואו. אפשר לשחק על זה, נו מה, אני לא מבין. אין לי כוח לבזבז את הזמן שלי על המשחק הזה. What the fuck?
My favorite part.
Let's go find them all.
איי איי.
I fall only when the gods will it.
I'm the jump master, this time. Here's a good spot to touch down.
Hostile close.
Here we go, ready up.
Might be something good this way.
You're in view of the enemy.
נו, כוס עמק, יש כל כך הרבה קבוצות עכשיו פה.
I'm getting hit over here. Firing. Boy jumping. Need to recharge my shields.
This way, you can.
Great, already inside the ring. Oh no, there's another squad attacking. More friends are coming to kill us. There's another squad. More friends are coming to kill us. There's another squad. Firing. Giving my shields a recharge. First blood made by us. Good work.
Reload. Full enemy squad.
What the fuck?
Forcibly expired.
I am taking fire, friends.
And so ends the champion's reign.
I have been downed.
Slinging an arc star. Arc star out.
Attention, there is a new kill leader.
You kill leader. You data. Reloading. Enemy removed. They're shooting at me. Firing.
מה, הוא למעלה שם.
Reloading. Full
Okay.
enemy squad is dead. Forcibly expired. Oh, I'm the kill leader. I can't wait to pop that trophy.
Phoenix, just a tick. Healing up.
ايوه سكين سكين
Rejuvenating.
الله למה נחתת שמה כמו אידיוט? מגיע לך. שיט.
I claim this banner in the name of science.
הוא הצליח יופי.
Also teamwork.
יש לו משהו טוב.
Dinna fast yourself. Here's a pick-me-up. Reckon we should head here.
I have come to save the day. Maybe.
Good, we're inside.
Half the squads remain.
Pulling the trigger. They're shooting at me. Recharging my shields.
Care package being delivered. Heads up. Package coming in. Wait ahead.
You kill leader. Data.
Reloading.
Reload.
Recharging.
Oh, a baller. Me and you are down.
Enemy down. They spotted me. I'm taking shots. Void running.
Oh shit. Ah shit.
This time I'm down.
I'm dead.
We killed the last member. Good work, team. I got you, friend.
Hostile right here. Hostile close.
I'm using
Please pick me up. There is someone over here.
Hostile right here.
The enemies are shooting at me. Opening fire on the enemy. Enemy down. I am down.
Balbots are shooting at me. Reloading.
My name is Ray. And we have a job to do.
I do not know what I'll become, but it will be striking.
is your champion.
Didn't I see some of you in the last match? Hard to tell. At this altitude, you're all ants.
It's time. I'm the jump master.
Oh, she's going to gloat about this all day.
Let's land here.
Oh, she's going to gloat about this all day. Oh, she's going to gloat about this.
Dropping in. Hang on. Let's go this way.
They might be watching. Joker over there.
זהו, בגלל זה אני עכשיו חשבתי על זה.
Throwing grenade. Am I the only one without a gun or what? Frag up. Stand back. Knuckle clusters firing. Ballet dogs.
First blood.
Stand back. Knuckle clusters firing. We are on. I'm taking fire.
הבנתי, אחי. אין לי כוח. למה אני אעשה את זה לעצמי?
Hello everyone, this is your daily dose of internet. The airport security had to take this guy to the back room for a closer look.
זה מוזר.
Should I get a dog?
מוזר.
Should I get a dog? Should I get a dog?
This professional biker went off a massive cliff in France.
What song are you listening to? What song are you listening to?
Actually, just nothing.
Nothing?
Yeah,
Oh,
I didn't
okay.
want anyone to talk to me.
Oh, okay.
This poor person had no idea that their audio was messed up.
Hi, my name is Darius.
Hi, my name is Serena.
Here's a really cool device that can shoot out ring bubbles underwater. A police officer saw that this car was not slowing down for these pedestrians and saved the day.
Shit.
You ever heard this sound on a plane before? You ever wonder what that means? A high-low chime like that means that one flight attendant is trying to call the other flight attendant, or the flight deck is trying to call us. If you hear 3 of those, that means it's an emergency, but you never will have to hear that.
One of my subscribers was walking around at night when all the streetlights started to flicker. I found a bird that enjoys tracing words and pictures on a tablet.
Great girl.
That's the end of this video. Hopefully I put a smile on your face, and I will see you guys again very, very soon. Later. Hello everyone, this is your Daily Dose of Internet. A truck carrying money opened up and scattered cash all over a highway.
Ever seen someone drop money all over the freeway? Literally everybody stopped on the freeway to get money off of the freeway. This is literally insane.
I missed it!
I just want to know how this is even humanly possible.
The orange low fucked up, what the fuck?
I feel like most people don't really know how... flexible an airplane wing is. This dog came home after having surgery and was still a little zooted.
Do you want to lay down? How about you lay down, kiddo? Yeah, go ahead and lay down.
I can't reach it! It's okay, I saw it coming.
This person found a little bug crawling on their rug.
What do you think about life?
The famous graffiti artist Banksy painted on this random person's wall, so the owner of the building decided to cut out the wall to sell it. She waited for someone to come unwrap her, but nobody ever came.
Aww. לא יפה.
Oh my...
Hey everyone, I am in my apartment right now, and if you look through my telescope, you will see that I found an eagle sitting on a branch in the snow. That is the end of this video. I really hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys again very, very soon. Later.
3 שנים והבן אדם הזה יש לו 12 מיליון. עוד מעט 13 מיליון. כל הכבוד. מלא סרטונים בתדירות של 4-3 ימים. אוקיי, זה טוב. אוקיי, איפה הבן אדם שאני מחפש?
Chef, did you do it?
Great shot on the beat, by the way. Back at the chops, don't squeeze it.
Know how to treat a nigga. They loving my style. They see me. Fuck them coats, they stole a ball for me. See them talking on her, never then they run from me. Call them cousin with that, call them drum dummy. Bitch, I don't need no feeling, need no numbing, nigga, take it. Why you got a gun, why don't you know them folks ain't hating? I don't feel no pressure when I'm in the shit. No, I don't feel no pressure when I'm in the shit. Look, fuck it, what they done for me. Free my homies, fuck them coats, they stole a ball for me. See them talking on her, never then they run from me. Call them cousin with that, call them drum dummy. Bitch, I don't need no feeling, need no loving, nigga, take it. Why you got a gun, why don't you know them fucks we hating? I don't feel no pressure when I'm in the shit. No, I don't feel no pressure when I'm in the shit. Look, watch what they done for me. Yeah, she used to front and now she wanna love on me. Hey, look, now she wanna rub on me. On my gun for me, thinking she the one for me. Look, I'm up, they wanna see me back now. Yeah, they left me the same ones, they turning back now. Love to see my family happy, shit, we blessed now. Yeah, we blessed now, remember we was stressed out, nigga. 100 cages for this necklace, this was two-tone, nigga. She just pull up, get to neck and shit, we too grown for this. Took some losses, I'm still winning, I'ma keep on winning. There was nobody looking out for me. Fuck the opposition, heard they out for me. I have all my hitters going out for me. Look, switching routes for me. Look, running out for me. What they done for me? Free my homies, fuck them coats, they stole a ball for me. See them talking on her, never then they run from me. Call them cousin with that, call them drum dummy. Bitch, I don't need no feeling, need no loving, nigga, take it. Why you got a gun, why don't you know the fucks we hating? I don't feel no pressure when I'm in the shit. No, I don't feel no pressure when I'm in the shit. In the shit.
Great shot on the beat, by the way.
Look, Glock on Biggie in the clip 2-pack. Get it? Tryna tunnel my vision like Tubman. Picasso couldn't even picture this. Now my pockets never end the wrecks. Catch me in a big body whip. And I'm riding around with the roof off. Got this baddie topping shit. And my hood get folded like a futon. Still no comfort in this bitch. Rapping just a niche. Look, know they watching shit. So my hoodie on like I'm Trayvon. But these Skittles knock the taste out of shit. Raining from these bowls, watching colors drip. You ain't get it then, but you get it now, nigga. I just keep switching the floor. Look, you wasn't there for the ring, you wasn't there through the storm. All this rage to make a nigga back out, don't get blipped out, nigga. Ain't no vet when I put your dog down, he get clipped out, nigga. Ain't no buck now.
Looking like I hit a lick. Still be on the strip. I got money and I still take a risk. Tell the shooters go and put them on the list. Before I ever seen runs taking packs to the mid. I'm thinking I still make it flip. Bro, so that nigga through the tent. And he got hit up in his whip. I was watching, they still up on our dick. All that shooting, they say that they doing, they still ain't make a hit. I'm shining, that bitch could've made a wish. Bag heavy, doing sit up with the chips. Hey, we ain't get it then, but we get it now, nigga. I'm Mary Jeans, got like 50,000 in them. Two blessed on my shirt, Dior. Got it out of the dirt for sure. A lot of shooters out searching for him. They release it with perfect form. Pockets on Biggie, I ride through the hood with like 2 straps. Ride in the coupe and put the roof back. We hit his top and put his roof back.
Old bitch ass nigga, snitch ass nigga, brick ass nigga, used to be gaining flip ass nigga. Hate these soft ass niggas, quick to pillow talk ass niggas, run and get hope ass nigga. Money on his head, I bought that nigga. I'm from the projects, nigga. Father was a gunshot victim. That's how I know them gunshots vicious. So I'm shooting first and I'm not missing. I get in contact with it,
a bug now, ain't it? Round town with a big gold grip on my lap. These bullets gon' have shit bacon. Move like a pig, this shit gon' go blah. Shut the fuck up, you bacon. Don't got time for a bitch, I just need cat. Married to the money I'm taking, married to the money I'm taking. Tired of the dubs, I love blue faces. He seeing the moves, our home moves, he racing. You know for the doctor, cause she is my patient. Money is colorful, I ain't no racist. Yeah, I ain't no racist. My money is colorful, I ain't no racist. Yeah, I ain't no racist. We riding around in a big body. Chef moving big walkie, old gas, no brakes, you can't stop us. Move funny, that ain't got him. She gave me brain, no real scholar. Look, she giving me good knowledge. We paved that way, we wave starters. I drip be like water, 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 be like water.
בן אדם הזה, אין סיכוי שאני לא מוצא אותו פה. אין סיכוי שאני לא מוצא אותו פה, אחי.
This is why you should always make sure you're home alone. One day, 2 police officers are sitting in their car waiting for their next call. They pull over a couple cars, but nothing unusual. A couple hours later, they get a call saying a woman feels like there is somebody in her house and she is hiding. The police, thinking it's some sort of home invasion, begin to rush to the scene. They pull up to the house and notice all of their lights are off and the doors are closed. The police begin to try and open the door, but the door is locked. They decided it would be quicker if they just bust a window and enter the scene. They busted the window and began searching. One officer says, "I'll search the left of the house and you search the right," and they both agree. The officer on the right finds a bathroom door that is cracked. And as he's opening it, he hears scratching and a faint whispering in the bedroom. He stops what he's doing and opens the door to the room. He pulls out his weapon and aims it at the closet and said, "Whoever's in there, come out now." He opens the door and finds nothing. At the same time, the officer to the left says, "I found her, the house is clear."
Yo, it's 2020. How do we still not know who this is? Jack the Ripper haunted the Whitechapel district of London from 1888 to 91, killing up to 11 women and terrorizing the community. He mailed letters and sometimes body parts to the local newspaper, once stating, "Here's a liver. I fried and ate the other one." Because his victims were disfigured and often missing organs from their body, it was clear that the killer was highly skilled in human anatomy. Despite developments in crime technology, he evaded police and was never identified.
Here's a terrifying true ghost story. 2 sisters were staying at a very old historic hotel in the middle of nowhere in Montana. The hotel had been around since the 1800s. It was one of the sisters' favorite hotels, and they've been multiple times. However, the other sister couldn't sleep because all she heard was someone walking around upstairs on hardwood floors, pacing around the room. In the morning, I asked my sister how she could have slept through it, and she told me that above, it used to be a ballroom where people used to dance, but now it was carpet
mail while he was gone for a few weeks. A few days later,
אוקיי. מה אני בא להגיד?
Of the hundreds of stories I have covered on this channel, today's
A large package arrives on his neighbor's front.
רק רגע, אני הולך להשתין.
Front porch. The man can barely lift it, but gets over to his garage where he accidentally drops it and hears something break inside. Hoping his neighbor would think the damage occurred en route, he closes his squeaky garage door and forgets about it. But over the next couple of days, whatever was in that package started to smell so bad that he decides to open it up. Inside were two very important finds: his neighbor, who was dead, and a camera that was still recording. The police bring the man in for questioning and show him what was on the camera inside the box. It starts with his neighbor talking to the camera about how excited he is to mail himself home for his YouTube channel. Then, police fast forward to the very end where they see that the neighbor is now sleeping in the box, and then suddenly gets dropped and you hear a crack, and that's his neck breaking. And then you hear a squeaky garage door close.
Urban legends to haunt you, the kidney heist. A man decided to go out one night on a date. He hadn't been out in a long time and he was really excited to meet this beautiful girl that he had met online. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary and he even paid for a dinner. He thought it was going great. However, the next day he thought maybe he just had too much to drink and he woke up in a bathtub. But then he was looking around and noticed that he was surrounded by ice. As he starts waking up and coming to his senses, he begins freaking out. He notices one of his kidneys are gone.
If you see this in Chuck E. Cheese, you need to leave immediately. So many of the workers at Chuck E. Cheese were reporting that these animatronics are coming alive by itself. Now never go to Chuck E. Cheese during the late night. If you don't see these animatronics on this stage and they're off, please run for your life. Many of the workers say that these robots come alive at night and have been taking children from their parents.
These TikTokers accidentally found a body. There's a popular app right now on TikTok called Randonautica that sends you to random locations in your area. Some people find random abandoned places.
Inmate, and it's just the audio recording, so he hears the interviewer ask the inmate, "Why did you remove all the door handles inside of your car?" The man just goes, "Well, the first time I tried to kill someone, I picked up a college hitchhiker who got smart at some point and jumped out of my car. So, lesson learned, remove all the door handles." When they showed his picture, the student knew immediately that he was supposed to be the first victim of John Wayne Gacy, aka the killer clown, who had killed over 30 men and boys in his clown room and stuffed them into his basement.
If someone calls out your name at night, you might not want to answer after watching this. As a kid, I was told stories about the legend of the night caller, and it was believed that if someone calls out your name in the middle of the night and you respond, a demon would appear out of nowhere and take you away. According to lore, a young girl stayed up late in her room when she heard her mom call out to her. The voice was so faint that she stopped what she was doing to listen closely. And again, she heard her mom's voice calling out to her. She responded, and almost immediately, her door, which was already closed, slowly opened, and someone was standing at the foot of the door. It was dark, and she couldn't make out the features of this person, but it had the form of her mom. The shadow figure then asked the girl to follow her. Thinking it was her mom, she got up and followed. The next day, a search began, but the little girl was never found. Coincidentally, most of the kids in the neighborhood claimed that they heard a voice call out to them that same night, but they were too scared to answer, and that is why
these are the strangest things that have ever been caught on camera. This video shows what appears to be a dark humanoid type creature crawling towards a bunch of boys playing soccer. Once the kids see it, they immediately run away in terror. Nobody knows for sure what this animal was, but many people claim that it was the South American mythical beast known as the Pombero. This next video was taken at the funeral of a 7-year-old girl. It shows one of the balloons that was next to her coffin somehow floating directly to her crying mother in the audience. Many people believe that this was the girl trying to comfort her mother from the grave.
The picture behind me might look like a normal photo, but it's actually one of the most sinister, real-life haunted photos in history. Taken by a professional photographer in 1972 as guests arrived for a wedding, everything in this picture looks happy and normal. But if you take a closer look at the man standing in black, you'll see something odd. You can actually see somebody in white crouching behind the man. All 4 of the people in the picture said that there was no one behind them when it was taken. The photographer said the same thing, and that it would be impossible for someone to crouch behind them without him seeing them. This is a better picture where you can actually see the guy's legs, and then in the top you can see his eyes. The picture was even examined by police photographers, and they confirmed that it was genuine.
This story is going to easily rank in the top 5 most distressing I have ever covered. Now, there is not any graphic footage or images included. However, there is a very upsetting sequence that happens at the end of this story. And so for that reason, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please take the like button hostage and force them to wash your dishes while wearing a very long sleeve shirt, but don't allow them to roll their sleeves up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In 1986, Tom Hawks was a 39-year-old father of 2 teenage boys. He had previously been married to his boys' mother, but they had ultimately gotten a divorce. That year, Tom and his 2 sons were at this local chili cook-off in their neighborhood in Newport Beach, California, when Tom was looking out across the sea of people, and he sees this stunningly beautiful woman he's never seen before, and he just finds himself staring at her. And he stares at her so long that this woman, she ends up noticing, and she looks up and kind of smiles and blushes and looks away, and Tom immediately is totally embarrassed because he just got caught staring at her, and so he decides, you know what, I gotta go over there and introduce myself. And so Tom, who's this totally ruggedly handsome, muscular guy with this incredible mustache, he strides across the lawn and he walks up to this woman and he introduces himself, and she is all smiles, and she says her name is Jackie and she's 29 years old and she's single. And from that point onward, those 2 completely hit it off. They fell madly in love. love. And just a few years later, in 1989, they got married in front of 150 of their closest friends and family. And then after the wedding, Jackie moved in with Tom and his 2 boys. And even though the boys' mother was still alive, they began calling Jackie Mom, because Jackie not only lived with them, but also because she was so devoted to them, and she just was such a loving and kind person that it just made sense to do that. Also, Jackie, when she was 22 years old, she had gotten into this horrific motorcycle accident and the internal damage that accident had done to her had left her unable to have kids of her own, something she had always wanted to do. And so when she had the opportunity accident and the internal damage that accident had done to her had left her unable to have kids of her own, something she had always wanted to do. And so when she had the opportunity to be these boys' mother, she really leaned into it. And so she was like this fabulous mother. So over the years, Tom and Jackie raised their 2 sons. And then in 2002, when the boys were all grown up, they left the house. Now, this was a sad moment for Tom and Jackie to suddenly be empty nesters. I mean, so much of their identity was wrapped up in being parents, and they were very close with their sons. But at the same time, they knew this day was coming, and they had actually been preparing for it for several years. They had been putting money aside every single year to prepare for when their sons left, because they wanted to time it so they could retire at the same time. And their idea of retirement was to go buy a yacht and just live on the yacht and sail up and down the California and Mexican coastline. Now, neither Jackie nor Tom were wealthy at all. However, they were very good at saving money, and they were very disciplined, and they could live frugally. And so over the past couple of years, they really had saved virtually every penny so they could afford to buy this yacht. And so finally, in 2002, when their sons do actually leave, Tom and Jackie, they sell their house in Newport Beach, California. And between the proceeds from the sale of their house and all this money they had set aside, they had enough to purchase this kind of beat up, old, small yacht. And so this yacht they named the Well-Deserved. Even though this yacht was by no means a glamorous yacht like you think of when you hear that word, Tom and Jackie adored this boat. And so as soon as it was theirs and they had docked it in Newport, they moved all of their belongings onto this boat because they're going to live on this boat. And then they began meticulously cleaning it and organizing it and upgrading it everywhere they could within their limited budget. And by the summer of that year, this boat was beautiful, both on the outside and the inside. It was very cozy and very clearly had the touch of Tom and Jackie. It was a home. And so for the next 2 years, Tom and Jackie, they lived the dream. They took that yacht and just sailed up and down the coast of California and Mexico, and they would watch these beautiful sunsets, and they would catch fresh fish, and they would drink cocktails together. I mean, they were really enjoying their retirement. Then, in 2004, they got some unexpected news. One of their sons told them that he was now expecting to be a father. And so this baby was going to be the first grandchild of Tom and Jackie, and they were so excited. Especially Jackie, because remember, she wasn't able to have kids of her own, and she just loved the idea of getting to be motherly again, and the idea of getting to hold this precious little baby. And so even though Tom and Jackie were absolutely loving living out on this yacht, they decided that the time was right to actually sell the yacht and then take the proceeds from the sale of the yacht and buy a house on land to be closer to their son and this grandbaby. So in November of that year, the Hawks place an ad in this fishing magazine for the sale of their yacht. They were asking for about $500,000. And very quickly after this ad went live, this young couple who had saved up some cash, they offered to buy it. Tom and Jackie were totally thrilled, and they called their two sons to tell them the good news that they had this buyer and that in the next couple of days the sale would be finalized and then they would be in touch. And so the sons, they're expecting to get a phone call from Tom and Jackie any day, but a couple of days goes by and they haven't heard from them. And so the sons begin calling their parents, and their parents aren't picking up their phone. Now, Tom and Jackie were not the type to go any amount of time without being in touch with their family. And so this was very uncharacteristic. And so when Tom's brother, Jim, who was a retired police chief, when he heard about this sudden silence, he just got in his car and drove to Newport Beach, California to see if maybe they had not finalized the sale of the yacht and maybe the couple was still on the yacht and he could go check in with them and make sure everything was okay. And so Jim, along with a friend of his, they arrive in Newport Beach, they make their way to the dock where the yacht was being held, and they go down to the floating section of the dock and they walk right up alongside the well-deserved, and just from where they're standing, it does not seem like anyone is on the yacht. However, as they're standing there just kind of looking at this yacht right in front of them, Jim notices a couple of oddities. He sees there are lines hanging over the side of the boat that should have been stowed. And Tom was known for being incredibly meticulous and orderly. I mean, that yacht was spick and span always. And so he would not have left these lines draped over the edge of the boat unless he was on board, and he wasn't. And so Jim's also looking around and he sees there are a couple of tarps that go over some of the control panels that had been taken off, but then not put back on the control panels. And so again, that's not something Tom or Jackie would have done. And then there's also some dirty towels kind of hanging out of one of the portholes. And so overall, the impression Jim and this friend got was, I guess they must have finalized the sale of this yacht, because clearly the new owners of this boat, they're the ones that are in possession of it, and they're the reason it's sloppy, because Tom and Jackie, they never would leave the boat in this condition. And so Jim pulls out his own business card and he writes a note on it that he's looking to speak with the new owners of this boat because his brother and his brother's wife had sold this boat to them, but now they're missing. And so please give me a call back. And so Jim and his friend, they leave the boat, they leave the dock, and they begin to leave the area when Jim's cell phone rings. And he picks it up, and it's this 21-year-old woman named Jennifer De Leon. And so she tells Jim that she got his business card on her yacht, and that yes, she and her husband had recently purchased this yacht from the Hawks. But like Jim, they were having a hard time getting in touch with the Hawks as well, because after acquiring their boat, Jennifer said she and her husband realized there were a couple of controls on the boat that they didn't know how to use. And so they needed to talk to Tom and Jackie to explain how to use them. Also, Jennifer said she had found some personal belongings that belonged to Tom and Jackie that were stuffed in a couple of drawers that just got left behind. And so she wanted to return that property to them as well. But she's telling Jim, I'm trying to get in touch with them and I can't get in touch with them. And so Jim asked Jennifer, when was the last time you or your husband saw Tom or Jackie? And she would say, the last time we saw them was when we actually finalized the sale of the boat, when we literally gave them the money and we watched them take the money, hop in their car, and drive away. Jim asked her if she had any idea where they might have been going. And Jennifer said, we really didn't have that many personal conversations with Tom or Jackie. It was mostly just business stuff. But in the limited personal interactions we did have, Tom would always talk about how he and Jackie planned on buying a house in Mexico in this town that bordered Arizona, because apparently they have a son that lives in Arizona and he's about to have a baby, and they were talking about how they wanted to be very close. Jim thanked Jennifer and asked her, if you hear from Tom or Jackie, please let me know. And then Jennifer says to Jim, same thing to you. If you hear from them, please let me know, because I need to talk to them too. And so they hang up, and Jim is left thinking, what's going on here? And then Jim remembers there's this woman that Tom and Jackie had hired. Her name was Patricia. And for the past couple of years that they had been out on their boat, they knew they would not have great internet. And so they would not be able to consistently be able to pay their bills and pay taxes. And so they had hired this woman, Patricia, who was also a friend of theirs, to basically pay their bills and manage their finances. And so Jim gets her number and he calls Patricia. And the first thing he asks her is, hey, have you spoken with Tom Tom or Jackie recently? And she says, no, I haven't. And so Jim explains the situation and then asks Patricia, has Tom or Jackie recently made a large deposit into any of their accounts? Because just a couple of days ago, they would have received nearly $500,000. And so Patricia, she checks the accounts and she says, no, there's been no deposits made. And so Jim and Patricia are talking on the phone, trying to rationalize why Tom and Jackie would not have deposited so much money, and they really couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for it. And so after Jim hung up with Patricia, he just had a bad feeling about what was going on. And so Jim called the Newport Beach Police Department and he officially reported Tom and Jackie missing. The first thing the Newport Beach Police Department did with this missing person report was to do some digging on the new buyers of this yacht, the De Leons. And when they looked at the 25-year-old husband named Skyler, they discovered he was a felon. He had been arrested and convicted of armed robbery and had spent some time in jail for it. And so naturally, the police were immediately suspicious of Skyler De Leon, and really the De Leons in general, because they were the last ones to see the Hawks before they went missing. And so they sent one of their detectives down to the dock to just kind of walk around the yacht and just kind of feel it out, see what's going on down there, see if there's anything unusual. And so this detective goes down to the dock, they walk onto the floating section of the dock, and they walk right up alongside the well-deserved. And from the looks of it, it doesn't appear that anybody's on board. And as this detective is kind of looking in the window and just kind of looking around, they think they see what looks like a bloody handprint inside the boat. And so that would end up being enough to get a search warrant. And before long that day, there were police swarming this boat, looking all over it. But it would turn out that was not a bloody handprint. It was actually just some rust. And there was nothing else of significance that was found on board this boat. And so the police are pretty frustrated because they really don't have any leads. And so they contact Skyler De Leon and they say, hey, you need to come into the police station and explain exactly what happened during your final interaction with the Hawks. And so Skyler comes to the police station, he's totally cooperative, and he explains to the detectives that, he saw this ad in this fishing magazine for a yacht. He contacted Tom Hawk and said, I'm interested. The two of them met up and then went out for a sea trial, which is basically a test drive, but for a boat. And during the sea trial, Skyler told Tom that he liked the boat and he wanted to go forward with the purchase. And so on November 15th, Skyler, along with his pregnant wife and his young daughter, and also a notary and another person, a friend of Skyler's that was there just kind of as a witness, they go to the parking lot of the dock right near where the yacht is. And then the Hawks show up, Tom and Jackie, and the De Leons literally hand over a suitcase full of cash to Tom, and then Tom and Jackie, with the notary, they signed the sale documentation, basically giving the boat over to the De Leons, and then Tom and Jackie took their suitcase full of cash, hopped in their SUV, and they drove off, presumably to go to Mexico. When the police asked Skyler, how were you able to afford such an expensive vessel, Skyler would tell them that back in the 1990s, he was actually a child star, or kind of. He was an extra on the very popular TV show Power Rangers, and from being on that show, he had made a bunch of money and he had set it aside. And as Skyler is telling the detectives this, he kind of just stops himself at some point and he's like, you know what? That's not really the truth. The reality is the reason we had the money to do this is not because of the cash I got from being a child star. It's actually because I stole the money. It would turn out that armed robbery that Skyler was convicted for and spent some time in jail for, that was because he was stealing money from this drug kingpin. And before he was arrested and sent off to jail, he had managed to take the money that he had stolen and hide it. And then after he had gone to jail and got out again, he came back to his hiding space and he just retrieved the money. But this money was stolen drug money, so it was hot. And so he needed to get rid of it. He needed to launder the money. And so that was why he was buying this yacht. He was going to buy it with this dirty money in bulk, in cash, and basically transform this hot, dirty money into this yacht. And then he was going to sell the yacht and get clean money for it. And so the police are totally shocked at this confession because Skyler has just completely incriminated himself in a money laundering scheme. But the police would ultimately say to Skyler, you know what, we're not going to charge you with money laundering because you're being so forthright and helpful with this investigation. And so they let Skyler go. The police would go on to interview Skyler's wife, Jennifer, as well as the notary and also that other friend who had come along for that final sale of the boat who was there as a witness. And so the police interview all three of those people people and they asked them, you know, what was your final interaction with Tom and Jackie like? And they all described the same situation of seeing Tom and Jackie taking the suitcase full of cash and then signing the paperwork, hopping in their car and driving off. The only detail that seemed to differ amongst these four people who were there was the way Tom and Jackie were acting. Skylar made it seem like Tom was kind of anxious and paranoid about having all this money, whereas the notary said, you know, Tom and Jackie seemed completely normal to me. After all the interviews with these people who had seen Tom and Jackie last, the police felt like they had kind of reached a dead end and just didn't know what to do next. And so they went to the media and asked them to put out a bulletin that had a picture of Tom and Jackie, as well as a picture of their vehicle, and it asked people to come forward if they had seen them. And sure enough, within a couple of days of this bulletin going out on TV, this older couple in Mexico called the police to say the Hawks SUV is right across the street from me right now. It's parked right on the road. And so naturally, the Mexican authorities, as well as American authorities, they rush to this location and they charge up to the house where this SUV is parked, and they're kind of expecting to find Jackie and Tom inside, or someone that at least knows Tom and Jackie. But when they knock on the door, this guy nobody recognized, someone who was living in Mexico, he comes up to the door and he's looking very confused, and the police ask him, you know, whose SUV is that parked outside? And he said, oh, well, that's my friend's car. And they say, well, is your friend Tom or Jackie Hawks? And the guy's like, no, who's that? The car belongs to Skylar De Leon. This was, of course, the moment when the police realized Skylar was lying to them. He had told police the last time he had seen Jackie and Tom, they had hopped in their SUV and they had driven off. But clearly that was not the last time, because he somehow managed to acquire their car afterwards, and then he gave it to this random person in Mexico. So the police in Newport Beach, they used Skylar's money laundering confession on camera to bring him in. They arrested him on money laundering, and then with him in custody, they searched his home. And inside of his and Jennifer's house, they found all these things that belonged to the Hawks. Things like laptops and video cameras, things Tom and Jackie would not have left behind on the boat. But despite all this evidence connecting Skylar De Leon to the Hawks' disappearance, he maintained his innocence and said this was just a big misunderstanding. And then while he was in custody getting grilled by police, his wife, Jennifer, was also saying the same thing, that Skylar didn't do anything. She was even going on talk shows and talking about how this is just one big misunderstanding and Skylar had nothing to do with the Hawks' disappearance, that they are just as concerned about Tom and Jackie as everybody else is. But the police were not buying it. They knew Skylar knew something that he wasn't telling them, obviously. However, they weren't really getting anywhere interviewing Skylar. He was just kind of saying, look, I had nothing to do with it. And so the police decide, let's go back and re-interview the notary and also that other friend who was there as a witness on that day that the final sale of the boat took place. And so they call the notary back into the police department, and the notary is this woman named Kathleen Harris, who's never gotten in trouble in her life, and she's been a very successful notary for a long time. And so she sits down, and they ask her again to describe her final interactions with Tom and Jackie. And once again, she says, yep, they came over, they signed the paperwork, they took their cash, they got in their SUV, and they drove off. But under follow-on, very intensive questioning by the police, Kathleen would finally break. And she would say, actually, I've never met Tom and Jackie in my entire life. I was paid up front in cash by Skylar De Leon to backdate those sale documents that had already been signed. I have no idea what happened to Tom and Jackie. Next, the police went out and got that friend who was also there at the time of the final sale, that witness. His name was Alonzo Mason. And so they bring him in and they ask him, you know, what was your final interaction like with Tom and Jackie? And at first he stuck to the story that, you know, they got the cash, they hopped in the SUV, they drove off, that's all it was. And the police stop him and they're like, we just spoke to the notary and she said she was lying. She wasn't even there. She had backdated those documents. So we know you're lying. And so as soon as Alonzo got caught red-handed, he began to clam up. It was pretty obvious he did not want to say anything else. And since the police really needed something to happen with this case, they said to Alonzo, we will make sure your sentence is heavily reduced if you tell us everything you know about what happened to Tom and Jackie. And so Alonzo says, okay, I'll tell you. Alonzo was a young guy, very impressionable. He was in his early to mid-20s, and he was actually a jailer, and he had met Skylar when Skylar was in jail. He was in jail for that armed robbery. And so after Skylar gets out of jail, Alonzo and Skylar somehow stay friends, and they spend a lot of time together. And then in November of 2004, Skylar pulls Alonzo aside, and he confesses to him that he is in fact an international assassin, that people paid him to kill people, but only bad people, Skylar said. And he says to Alonzo, I have a current contract on 2 really bad people, Tom and Jackie Hawks, but I need help carrying this out. And so if you will help me carry out this contract, I will give you $1 million US. And so Alonzo's like, man, okay, yeah, I'll help you. And so on November 15th, Skylar, Alonzo, and a third man that Skylar had recruited to be a part of this job. He was this big, muscular, intimidating-looking guy who was actually a longtime Southern California gang member. His name was John Kennedy. Those 3, they show up at the parking lot of the dock not to finalize the sale of this yacht. They weren't even close to finalizing the sale. They were there to meet up with Tom and Jackie to do a sea trial, a test drive. But when Tom and Jackie arrive, Tom, who was a longtime probation officer and so was very used to being around felons and convicts, he immediately sized these 3 up and thought, bad news. And so when the 2 parties met each other in the parking lot, Skylar started to notice that Tom was definitely apprehensive about getting on a boat with them. In fact, Tom was talking about potentially rescheduling and that, today's not a good day. And Skylar's seeing, okay, they're clearly uneasy about getting on the boat with us. And so Skylar says, hey, Tom, Jackie, hold on a minute. I'm going to step aside and make a phone call. And so Skylar steps aside and he calls his wife, Jennifer, and she was not far away. And so just a couple of minutes later, Jennifer pulls into the parking lot carrying her little 1-year-old baby girl. And as soon as she walks over to this group, the dynamic completely changes. Jackie sees this baby and she immediately falls in love with it and she wants to hold the baby and she loves Jennifer. Jennifer is so sweet. And so Jackie seems very much at ease and Tom notices that. And so Tom begins to loosen up, and before long, Tom is saying to Skylar, you know what, guys? Today's fine. Let's do the sea trial. And so the group eventually begins to make their way onto the yacht, the well-deserved, to do the sea trial. And right as they're about to get on, Jennifer says, hey guys, I can't go on the sea trial. The baby's upset. I gotta go home. I'll see you guys when you get back. And at this point, Tom and Jackie, they've already committed to doing the sea trial. And so even if they were a little bit apprehensive going on this boat with just these 3 guys, they put their faith in the De Leons that this was on the up and up. So the 2 Hawks, along with these 3 men, they get on board the boat and they begin heading out towards open water. And so Tom was piloting the boat. And at some point when they were very far away from the dock and really any land in any direction, Skylar and John come up to Tom and they say, hey, we want to show you something down in the lower levels of the ship. And so Tom goes with them. They go downstairs into the bedroom. And while they're down there, Alonzo and Jackie were in the kitchen, which is right above the bedroom. And as they're standing there, Alonzo and Jackie suddenly hear this very loud commotion coming from the bedroom. Now, Alonzo knew what that was. It was Skylar and John attacking Tom. And so that was his cue. Alonzo leapt forward and he grabbed onto Jackie. And before Jackie could even figure out what was going on, he had thrown her to the ground, pulled her hands behind her back, and then he pulled out handcuffs that he had and he handcuffed her hands together.
Sounds like Jackie's here, Alonzo's here, and then that's where Thomas Hawks, Skylar, and JFK are on the bottom. And Jackie hears the commotion. She looks down this way, and this is where Alonzo overpowers her.
And as soon as Jackie was subdued in the kitchen, Skylar and John, they come up the stairs, and Tom's not with them, and they grab Jackie, and they walk her down into the bedroom, and Jackie would have seen her husband, Tom. He's been handcuffed, and he's laying on the bed on his back. And so they throw Jackie onto the bed right next to Tom, and immediately Jackie turns around and looks at Skylar and says, why are you doing this to us? We just met your wife. I just held your baby. Why are you doing this? All we want to do is just go back to land and be with our children and be with our grandchildren, please. But Skylar didn't care. He just turned to Alonzo and said, put tape on both of their mouths and their eyes. And as Alonzo was doing that, Skylar went upstairs and began piloting the boat towards the deepest part of the ocean. And so as Skylar is driving this boat, Alonzo and John are down in the bedroom, and Alonzo remembers looking over at Tom, and Tom was comforting Jackie. He had managed to pull his hand up and and he was stroking Jackie's hand, and he was saying to her, "It's going to be okay. No matter what happens to us, we'll be together." Suddenly, the boat stopped because Skylar had reached the deepest part of the ocean, and he called down to John and Alonzo to bring Jackie and Tom up onto the deck. And so Alonzo and John do just that. They march Tom and Jackie up the steps, they bring them out to the deck of the ship, and then Skylar forces them to sign the sale documentation for the boat, as well as had them sign additional paperwork that gave Skylar access to their bank accounts. And while they were signing these documents, Jackie actually misspelled her last name on one of the signature blocks. She left the S off of her last name. That's not something she would have done by accident. It's pretty clear she did that on purpose to signal to the future that she signed this under duress. After all these documents were signed, the three men led their two captives to the back of the boat. And then once they were standing at the back of the boat, Skylar tells Alonzo, in earshot of Jackie and Tom, to, hey, go to the front of the boat and get the anchor. And so Tom and Jackie, they know that whatever's going to happen to them next, it's not good. And so Jackie begins pleading with them to let them live, let them go back to land, let them see their grandchild. And Tom manages to shake his restraints from John, who was holding him, and he manages to kick Skylar really hard in the groin. But after that, John leapt on top of Tom and Jackie and subdued both of them. And then he positioned Tom and Jackie so they were sitting down back to back with their handcuffs connected to each other. And then Alonzo shows up dragging this heavy anchor, and he finally gets it all the way over until it's right next to Tom and Jackie, at which point Skylar grabs the long metal chain that came off of the anchor, and he felt around until he got to the very end of the chain. So not the side closest to the anchor that's attached to it, the far other side, the bitter end of this chain. And he reached down and he connected that portion of the chain to Tom and Jackie's handcuffs. And then once he was sure their handcuffs were securely fastened to the end of this chain, Skylar stood up, walked over and grabbed the anchor, and with quite a bit of effort, he managed to lift it up and threw it over the side of the boat. As soon as that anchor hit the water, all Tom and Jackie would have heard for several seconds would be the sound of all of that loose chain that they were connected to being rapidly pulled off the boat and being sucked down into the water. And so that chain was going up and over this wooden railing, and so all they would have heard is just chain links grinding over the railing until finally the anchor pulled the chain tight, at which point it yanked Tom and Jackie towards the side of the boat. Alonzo would say when this happened, Jackie's head struck the inside of the side of the boat so hard it made this very loud, audible cracking sound. And then Skylar, Alonzo, and John just stood there as Tom and Jackie desperately tried to fight against the weight of this anchor that was trying to pull them off of the boat. Tom was trying to hold on to anything he could to try to hold his wife in place, but eventually the weight of this anchor combined with the movement of the boat was just too much. And so Tom and Jackie were very slowly pulled up and over and off the boat into the water. When they hit the water, they would have been fully alive, fully conscious, as they began their rapid descent to the bottom of the ocean, 3,500 feet below. Alonzo would tell police as soon as Tom and Jackie disappeared below the surface, Skylar let out a woohoo and ran over to the edge of the boat and looked into the water like a giddy child. And he was staring at where they had disappeared, and he was just grinning and laughing. And then finally, when the water went calm and there were no more bubbles, Skylar just kind of laughed, turned around, and made his way back to the cockpit and began piloting the boat back towards the dock. Even though Jennifer was not on the boat at the time of the murder, she was equally involved in it. In fact, the attack was her idea. She wanted more money, and she saw this scheme as being a way of doing that. So remember, when she showed up at the dock parking lot with her baby and put Jackie and Tom at ease to help get them out on that sea trial, she was doing that very intentionally to trap Jackie and Tom. She knew what was going to happen out on that boat. She was trying to get them to go so they could be murdered and they could steal their boat. And when Skylar was out on the boat, before, during, and after the murders, he would step aside and call Jennifer to let her know how it was going and kind of get her feedback and ask for advice about what they should do next. With that in mind, one of the darker elements of this case has to do with the video camera that was discovered inside of Jennifer and Skylar's house. It was the Hawks video camera, and they had used it over the past couple of years to document their travels out on the ocean. And so when the police acquired this video camera, they played the tape that was inside of it. And at first, the tape shows Jackie filming the inside of the well-deserved yacht, and she's talking about how sad it was that this is probably one of the last times they'll be inside of this boat. But she and Tom are so happy because they've found buyers who are going to take great care of this boat, and they're excited about the future, they're excited about their grandchild. And then suddenly, this footage of Jackie inside of the boat just totally cuts, and it jumps to Skylar and Jennifer at Thanksgiving dinner that year, playing with their daughter and just having this great time, meaning just days after Jennifer and Skylar murdered Tom and Jackie in the worst way imaginable, they took their camera and just began using it for their own lives, recording their own life over the memories of Tom and Jackie. Jennifer and Skylar truly didn't care at all about what they had just done. Alonzo would ultimately be sentenced to 20 years in prison. He would have gotten a much more severe sentence, but because he provided all of the details of what happened and he was promised a reduction in sentence, he was only given 20 years. Jennifer would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and John Kennedy and Skylar were sentenced to death.
מגיע לכם, נודר מגיע לכם. נודר מגיע לכם.
Possibility of parole.
מגיע לך ומגיע לך יחד מניאק.
Parole, and John Kennedy and Skylar were sentenced to death. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode, it looks like CCTV camera footage. Like, it looks like that he was rappelling down on, he needed technical gear.
אני אחפש משהו טוב, בא לי לראות משהו שירדים אותי.
Today, I'm going to be and you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to install all husband, and she was living with her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ McGinnis, who were both 54 years old. On April 2nd of that year, the trio decided to visit Big Sur, which is the very beautiful but very steep and dangerous section of the Central California coastline. They pulled over at a particular cliff overlooking the water to take some pictures. Afterwards, as they were getting ready to go back to their car, Deanna wanted a closer look, so she stepped to the edge of the cliff where she lost her footing and she fell 500 feet to her death. It was ruled an accident, so investigating officers refrained from taking any on-scene photographs, accepting instead Virginia's photographs that she said she had taken right before it happened. Deanna's mother was unable to afford a funeral for her daughter, and so the only person she could think to ask to help her was a lawyer that went to the same church as her. His name was Steve Keeney, and Steve said, yeah, of course, I'll try to make some phone calls for you and see what I can do. And in doing so, he wound up learning about the case, about what happened to Deanna, and he discovered that her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ, had actually taken a life insurance policy out on Deanna the day before she fell off the cliff. And so Steve began digging into the backgrounds of Virginia and BJ, and he discovered that Virginia had a history of being around a high number of accidental deaths and suspicious fires, and that she had cashed in a whole bunch of life insurance policies. So all of a sudden, Deanna's death did not look accidental. Steve would become obsessed with the idea that the McGinnises were behind Deanna's death, but unfortunately, there was virtually no evidence to support that, because when she died, the investigating officers ruled it an accident. So there was no crime scene, there was no evidence collected, the autopsy was very cursory, And so Steve would spend 5 years building a case against Virginia and BJ, but at the end of those 5 years, it was a rock-solid case, and Virginia and BJ were arrested. During their trial, the real story of what happened to Deanna finally emerged. On that April day in 1987, the trio went to Big Sur, and they had lunch together, they had a picnic, and while they were eating, BJ slipped some of his prescription antidepressants into Deanna's drink, and so after lunch, the drugs were in Deanna's system, and she began to get very drowsy, to the point where Virginia and BJ had to literally hold her up. She was falling over, she was so tired. And so while Deanna's in the state, Virginia and BJ tell her, hey, let's go over to the cliffs and take some pictures. And so they walk over, Deanna's stumbling and BJ's holding her up, and they get to the edge of the cliff, and BJ turns around so the ocean's at his back, and he's propping up Deanna, and Virginia steps away and she takes their picture. And then right after that picture, BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge, and Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this, BJ took Deanna and them facing the water, and kind of right after her up, and they get to the edge of the cliff, and BJ turns around so the ocean's at his back, and he's propping up Deanna, and Virginia steps away and she takes their picture. And then right after that picture, BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge, and Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is that as soon as he threw her off, Deanna kind of came to and whipped herself around and managed to grab onto the cliff with her hands. And so she's literally dangling, holding onto this ledge like in the movies, begging to be pulled back up. And Virginia and BJ, instead of helping her back up, picked up rocks and bashed her hands until she fell off the cliff. Ultimately, it would be these last two pictures that Virginia took that got her and BJ convicted of killing Deanna, because these pictures clearly showed Deanna was impaired compared to the earlier pictures on the camera roll. And the only reason these pictures existed is because Virginia wanted a trophy from the killing, because she was actually an uncaught serial killer that went around killing people and cashing in their life insurance policies. One of her victims even included her own 3-year-old daughter. BJ would actually die during his trial. As for Virginia, she was found guilty and sent to jail for life. Here are the final two pictures that Virginia took of Deanna. On July 30th, 2016, Janice Stewart was at home in College Station, Texas, preparing for a wedding she was going to be photographing the following week. Her 34-year-old daughter, named Sunday Rowan, lived a few hours away in San Antonio, and she was planning to go with her to help her take these pictures. As Janice worked, her cell phone kept buzzing. Since sunrise, Sunday had been Snapchatting her photos of her and her husband Matt, who was also 34, as they got ready for their hot air balloon ride that day.
זה פשוט אומר, לא.
18 months earlier, Sunday had bought Matt the tickets as a birthday gift, but the trip kept getting delayed because of bad weather. But on this July morning, the weather had cleared up and the trip was finally happening. Sunday and Matt often sought adventure to balance the demands of their jobs. Matt was the chief of clinical trials at the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio and was a rising star in the field of burn research. Sunday worked at Crazy 8, which was a kids' clothing store, and she was devoted to her young son from a previous relationship. At 6:58 that morning, Janice received an image of the balloon's ground crew prepping the wicker basket that would hold her daughter, her son-in-law, and the rest of the other passengers. Around 7:30, Janice received another image. This one was a selfie of Sunday and Matt posing inside of the wicker basket. They were up in the air. There's a beautiful field below them. They're smiling and they're hugging. After that, the messages stopped. 10 minutes later at 7:40, 85-year-old Buddy Miller was making breakfast in his ranch when he heard two loud explosions. The first one actually rattled his house. When he looked out the window, he saw this massive plume of black smoke on another rancher's land off in the distance. Alarmed, he jumped in his pickup truck and raced past his cows to the blaze a half-mile away. Commotion like this rarely occurred in Maxwell, Texas, a quiet rural community about 40 miles south of Austin. At her home just up the road was 66-year-old Margaret Wiley, who heard the explosions too. She said the first one reminded her of the sound her 20-gauge shotgun made. When she stepped onto the porch, she heard the second explosion, and she said it sounded like a loud pop, followed by a whooshing sound, like the sound a gas stove makes when it ignites. When she looked out towards where the sounds had come from, she saw this massive fireball explode in the distance, and she immediately called 911. When Buddy and the other first responders arrived at the scene, they saw this huge fire at the base of a power line tower, and at first they couldn't figure out what was actually burning. They heard the sound of hissing propane tanks and thought maybe it was a tractor or a baler that had caught on fire. But upon closer inspection, they saw a wicker basket and they saw bodies. This was a hot air balloon accident. It would turn out the pilot of that hot air balloon was 49-year-old Skip Nichols, and he had elected to fly that day despite a low cloud cover that had grounded the other hot air balloon companies in the area that morning. Also, Skip was on a mixture of prescription and over-the-counter drugs that impaired his ability to fly the balloon safely. After being in the air for 8 miles above the clouds, Skip decided it was time to land, and so he blindly descended through the clouds and he immediately hit a power line. An arc carrying 340,000 volts of electricity cut the balloon's metal support cables like a torch. As soon as the basket began plummeting toward the earth, the fuel lines disconnected from the burners overhead, spraying liquid propane up into the burners and then arced back down into the wicker basket, immediately engulfing the entire thing in flames. The burning basket fell over 100 feet to the ground. By 10 a.m. that morning, Janice had still not heard from her daughter after that last text she sent, which included the picture of her and Matt, that selfie image up in the balloon, and Janice was concerned that something had gone wrong. So she turned on the TV, and the first thing she sees is hot air balloon crash in Texas, no survivors. And on the screen, she immediately recognized the smiley face that was on the balloon that had crashed because she recognized it from the images her daughter had sent her. Even before she got the official call, she knew instinctively that her daughter and her son-in-law were both gone. Here are the final pictures taken of Sunday, Matt, and the other 14 people who were on board that balloon. On September 25th, 1978, a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 jet airliner entered San Diego airspace. Like all PSA aircraft, Flight 182 had a whimsical black button nose and smiley face painted underneath the cockpit. These so-called grinning birds were synonymous with the company's self-promoting ad campaign about them being the world's friendliest airline. But the airline was often criticized for being too friendly with their super low airfares, their kind of comic banter that the captains would employ through the intercom to passengers, and their female flight attendants who wore miniskirts and were instructed to make nice with the male passengers. Because the weather was clear, air traffic control directed Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox to switch from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules procedures and to begin their final descent. Visual flight rules refers to pilots using their eyes to guide the plane. It's done when they're flying low, the weather's clear, and they can see the ground. At 8:59 a.m. that morning, as PSA Flight 182 descended down to 4,000 feet, air traffic control advised them of a Cessna, which is a small plane, that was ascending in their direction. Fox responded that they saw the Cessna, and so air traffic control came back and said to maintain visual separation. Maintain visual separation meant that despite ground radar-based controllers who could provide vertical and lateral separation criteria, the burden for maintaining separation fell solely on Captain McFerrin and his crew. In layman's terms, air traffic control was telling them, don't lose sight of the Cessna. Inside the Cessna was a flight instructor named Martin Casey and his student, who was a United States Marine named David Boswell. As this little plane ascended, air traffic control informed them that PSA 182, who was right in front of them and slightly above them, they were on their descent. However, they had the Cessna in sight. As a result, the men inside of the Cessna did not take it upon themselves to actively begin looking for this jet. They assumed the pilots of PSA 182, who had them in sight, would avoid them. Back in PSA 182, there seemed to be some confusion in the cockpit. The two pilots were debating whether the Cessna they were watching fly lower than them, past them on the right, was the same Cessna that air traffic control had told them about. And at some point they agreed, yep, that's got to be the same Cessna. And so they called in to air traffic control that it looks like the Cessna has passed us. They've flown past us on the right. Immediately after this transmission, the black box recorded the two pilots talking to each other, basically trying to convince the other that yes, that was definitely the right Cessna. But after a couple of minutes of reassuring themselves, one of them says, boy, I hope that was the right Cessna. According to later testimony by the air traffic controller who was in communication with the pilots of PSA 182 as they were on their final descent, he would say when Captain McFerrin came over and said the Cessna has passed him on the right, he believed him and he didn't think to check to make sure it was the right one. But in reality, the Cessna that McFerrin and Fox had seen was the wrong one. The real Cessna they were supposed to maintain visual separation with, the one containing Casey and Boswell, was still ascending in the direct flight path of PSA 182, except now this Cessna is in 182's blind spot below their nose, so they literally can't see each other. At 9:01 that morning, air traffic control got an alarm that PSA 182 and this Cessna are about to collide, but for some reason the air traffic controller did not alert both aircraft. Instead, this controller only contacted the Cessna and didn't tell them this was a dire situation. They said, hey, there's traffic in your vicinity, but I'm pretty sure it's just PSA 182 and they already see you, so you're fine. So Casey and Boswell inside of the Cessna just continued to ascend. 1 minute later at 9:02 a.m., PSA 182 flies directly over the Cessna and strikes them with their nose wheel. The Cessna gets hooked by the wheel and flips upside down and gets trapped underneath the right wing of the jet. Seconds later, the Cessna splits in two. The tail section containing David Boswell plummets to the earth like a rag doll. The nose section of the Cessna that contained Martin Casey stayed trapped underneath the right wing for a few seconds before it detonated. Inside of PSA 182, this explosion was deafening, and immediately after it, McFerrin was recorded saying, easy baby, easy baby. Then he asks Fox, what's the damage? And Fox says, it's bad, man, we're hit. Despite trying to keep the plane flying level, it lurched forward into an unrecoverable nosedive, and McFerrin, knowing they were doomed, calmly calls out to air traffic control and says, we're going down. Air traffic responded, okay, we'll have the equipment ready for you. Then the black box recorded the sound of a stall warning inside the cockpit, and as the aircraft streaked at over 300 miles per hour straight towards the ground, McFerrin's last known transmission to air traffic was, "This is it, baby." Seconds before impact, McFerrin gave his final command over the intercom, which was, "Brace yourselves," and then right before the black box cut out, someone in the cabin yelled, "I love you, Mom." At 9:03 a.m., PSA 182 slammed nose first into the ground just outside of downtown San Diego in an area called North Park. The resulting explosion of thousands of gallons of jet fuel sent a shockwave that was registered 2 miles away. Almost immediately, firefighters were rushing towards the rising mushroom cloud of black, oily smoke, and many of the first responders that arrived at the crash site in those first few hours were deeply disturbed at what they saw. The bodies that had not been destroyed in the explosion had gotten trapped up in the trees. All told, 144 people were killed in this accident. 135 were from PSA 182, 2 were from the Cessna, and 7 were just unlucky people that were standing on the ground in North Park. Following a 1-year investigation into the mid-air collision, it was determined that the flight crew of PSA 182 was found to be primarily responsible because there was that moment that was picked up in the black box where the 2 pilots were unsure if the Cessna that passed them was the right one, but instead of calling that into air traffic control and getting confirmation, they blew it off. The morning of the crash, a San Diego photographer was at a press event when he heard the explosion overhead, which was 182 colliding with the Cessna, and he began taking pictures, and he captured these now 2 infamous photos of PSA 182 seconds before they hit the ground. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to install brand new, beautiful hardwood floors at the Like Button's house. And on installation day, remove...
Little Bob?
Little Bob.
Might land on you. Come on, Donald. Don't do me like that. Come on, Donald. Just, yeah.
Okay.
Move all of their original flooring and then...
Thank you. Appreciate it. Such a fucker, man. No, I'm joking.
Move all of their original flooring and then quit the job. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. I don't know about you, but I am far more interested in mysteries that have occurred in the relatively recent past. I think it's easier to relate to the people involved because they probably lived their lives kind of similar to how you're living now. Different, but similar, right? You know, and also like the information, if you're looking at a case that happened 50 years ago or less, it's easier to fact check that information, and there's probably more information about that case. Whereas if you're looking at something that's happened, let's say hundreds and hundreds of years ago, while certainly there are people involved and being a human being, I can relate to them in that sense, but the way they lived is a lot different than we live now. And so it's very difficult to kind of put myself in their perspective because my experience living on the earth is so much different. And of course, information, even if it was diligently transcribed at the time, it's taken hundreds of years to arrive in front of me now. And so the opportunity for information to change or to be passed down inaccurately or to just be a straight up embellishment is much higher. So the accuracy of information in older cases, it's a little bit up for grabs. So I tend to be interested in more recent mysteries. But there is one case, in fact, it is the oldest unsolved mystery in American history that I have been fascinated with ever since I heard about it in grade school. And the reason I'm talking about it now in this video is not only have I found it fascinating, but there has been some recent discoveries, as recent as 2011, that totally changed the theories about what could have happened in this particular case. And the case I'm referencing is the lost colony of Roanoke. The too long didn't read version of this story is when England first tried to colonize America, they set up a colony on Roanoke Island, which is right off the coast of North Carolina. And when it wasn't going very well and the early colonists, they needed more supplies, they sent their leader back to England to get more supplies. But when he came back, the colony was gone. All 115 people gone without a trace. And all that was left were two strange messages. One was on a tree and one was on a fence post right in where the colony used to be. And for centuries, historians and amateur sleuths alike have debated what those messages mean. But a recent discovery in 2011 completely changes people's interpretation of what happened at Roanoke. Before we get started, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, you've come to the right channel because that is literally all I'm going to be doing, and I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these cool stories. All right, let's dive in. By the late 1500s, England wanted to colonize America. And in the early 1580s, an Englishman by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh was basically given a permit to go colonize America. Basically it said, okay, it's 1580, and you have until 1591 to colonize somewhere in America. If you can't do it by then, you're gonna lose your permit. He starts getting funding together, he starts looking on a map to figure out where's a good spot to land, and by 1584, he's ready to launch his first reconnaissance mission to America. So in 1584, 2 ships make their way to North America and they land somewhere in Southwest Airlines plane. That morning, she, along with 143 other passengers and the 5 crew members, would be flying from New York City to Dallas, Texas. And then after that 4-hour flight, Holly would get off that plane and board another plane from Dallas to Oklahoma City, where she lived. But luckily, that flight was only about an hour long. After Holly buckled her lap belt, she put her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her, and then she waited to see who was going to be sitting in the 2 seats to her left. A few seconds later, a 43-year-old bank executive and mother of 2 named Jennifer Reardon came walking down the aisle and stopped right outside of row 14 and turned into the aisle towards Holly. And Holly, who was kind of keeping her head down, she noticed there was this person standing outside of her aisle, and so she turned and looked up, and looking down at her was this big bright smile, and Jennifer said to her, hey, can I sit next to you? Is anybody using those seats? And Holly would say, nope, I'm here by myself, go right ahead. Unlike other airlines that would assign seats to all of their passengers before they boarded, Southwest Airlines has an open seating plan. What they do is they basically group passengers into boarding groups, but then once that group is on the plane, it's first come, first serve. After Jennifer slid past Holly and made her way to the window seat where she sat down, which was seat 14A, she buckled her lap belt, and then just like Holly, she took her carry-on bag and stuffed it under the seat in front of her, and then she pulled a paperback book out of her bag and started reading it. For the next few minutes, as more and more passengers came onto the plane, nobody took the seat between Holly and Jennifer, because generally speaking, people don't like riding in the middle seat if there is a window or aisle seat available, because it's just not very comfortable sitting between 2 people for hours at a time. But eventually, the only seats left were middle seats. And at some point, this preteen girl who had her head buried in her phone, she comes onto the plane and she works her way down and she stops outside of row 14 and she very politely asks Holly if she can sit between her and Jennifer. And Holly says, absolutely. And so this girl slips past Holly and she sits down in seat 14B. She puts her lap belt on, she takes her carry-on, puts it under the seat in front of her, and then she just goes back to looking at her phone. Now that all of Holly's seatmates had arrived and she would not need to be getting out of the way for more people to come into a row, Holly kind of relaxed for a minute and she pulled out her iPad and she began scanning through the news as she waited for the plane to finish boarding. After all the passengers had been seated, one of the flight attendants closed the airplane door and then they grabbed the microphone and welcomed everyone aboard the plane and thanked them for choosing Southwest Airlines. And then they reminded everyone on board to make sure their seatbelt was fastened, that their tray was in the upright position, that their seat was upright as well, that they'd stowed big electronics. And then with the help of several other flight attendants, they went over some basic safety procedures in case of a mid-air emergency. Most of the passengers on this flight were really not paying attention to the safety brief. They were trying to sleep, or they were stowing their stuff, or they were sending one last text message. But Holly, on the other hand, she was paying careful attention. Now, this wasn't totally unusual for her. She was generally safety conscious, but for some reason on this flight, she just had a sense that something bad was about to happen. There was this deep sense of foreboding that she normally didn't feel on flights. And so she found herself really carefully paying attention to these procedures in case something did go wrong. After the brief was over, the attendant who was holding the microphone thanked everyone for listening and then said, "Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." But Holly couldn't do that because, one, she really did have this weird sense that something was off about this flight, that something bad was going to happen, and she just didn't know why. And then number two, she remembered that she had drank this huge cup of iced coffee before she boarded the plane, and so now she really had to use the bathroom. But the plane had already begun taxiing over to the runway, and an attendant had told her she had to sit down. You can't go to the bathroom now, you gotta wait until we're up in the air. And so Holly, who was now feeling very mentally and physically uncomfortable, found herself kind of anxiously looking to her left out the window as the plane continued to taxi to the top of the runway. And then once the plane was set, it paused for a second, and then the engines fired, and Holly and the girl next to her and Jennifer all got sucked back into their seat as the plane began hurtling down the track. And so Holly, the girl, and Jennifer, they're all turned, they're looking out the window as the plane is just bombing straight ahead. They're watching the airport kind of disappear out of view, and then they feel the plane begin to get lift, and then they take off. As the plane rapidly ascended, Holly turned away from the window and just sat back and closed her eyes and was just picturing that moment when they reached their cruising altitude, and she would hear that chime in the cabin, and then the captain would come on the intercom and say, "We've reached our cruising altitude, it's now safe to get up and walk around," at which point Holly was going to run to the bathroom. And so when the plane finally got to a point where Holly felt like they were starting to level out, they probably were going to be at their cruising altitude soon, Holly preemptively undid her seatbelt and turned to face the aisle, getting ready for that chime in the cabin so she could get to the bathroom as soon as possible. But that chime didn't happen. Instead, when they reached their cruising altitude, the captain came on the intercom and she would tell everyone that they had reached their cruising altitude, but no one can leave their seats yet. They were expecting some fairly rough air, some turbulence. And so Holly was totally frustrated and disappointed, and she let out this audible grunt out of frustration. And Jennifer, who had her head in her book, she hears this grunt and she turns to look at Holly to make sure she's okay. And at the exact same time, Holly found herself kind of looking down and turning towards the window to look out the window. And she made eye contact with Jennifer. And immediately Holly recognized that Jennifer thought something was wrong with her, and she was kind of looking at her to make sure she was okay. And Holly just goes, "I really have to go to the bathroom." And so at this, the two women kind of laughed about Holly's plight because it was kind of funny that she desperately needed to go but wasn't allowed to. And so eventually Jennifer just said, "I'm sure they'll let you go soon." And then Jennifer went back to her book, and Holly went back to anxiously waiting to use the bathroom, and the girl sitting between them did not care at all. She was not listening to them, she didn't care. She had her head buried in her phone. After several minutes, Holly started to worry that it might be a while before she was allowed to get up and move around, because she's looking at the flight attendants and they're all buckled into their jump seats and they were hitting some turbulence. And so Holly's thinking, okay, I gotta do something to take my mind off of this discomfort. Not only the physical discomfort of needing to use the bathroom, but also that strange foreboding. It just was not going away. And she didn't know what it was, but she just had the sense that something bad was going to happen. And so Holly decided she would do some work. And so at 11:04 a.m. Eastern, she reached down below the seat in front of her and began fishing around in her bag for her laptop. Before she could grab it, she heard two deafeningly loud sounds in rapid succession. The first was a popping sound that came from outside of the plane near the left wing. And the left wing was right outside of their window. And then she heard this whooshing sound that went through the entire cabin. It was like a high-powered vacuum. And then the entire cabin became freezing cold as the plane banked hard to the left. After all this happened, in this fraction of a second, Holly sat up, and it was like she was immediately in shock. She's looking out across the other seats, and she sees all those oxygen masks have deployed from the ceiling. People are screaming, the attendants are running up and down the aisle trying to help people put their masks on as the plane is hard banking to the left, and Holly just kind of robotically reaches out and grabs the mask right in front of her, and she tries to put it on, but despite having listened intently to the safety brief, it was like her hands didn't work, and she couldn't get the band to extend long enough to put it over her head. And so she's fumbling with this mask, still in shock. She can't believe this is actually happening. This is how she's gonna die. And then it's like she snaps out of it, and she forgets about the mask, and she turns left to make sure the girl and Jennifer were okay. and what she saw was absolutely horrifying. That popping sound she heard outside of the plane was the sound of the engine underneath the left wing exploding. And when it detonated, the cowling, which is the outside of the engine, it kind of protects the engine, it broke apart. And one of the pieces of this cowling flew and hit the side of the aircraft, and it struck the window of row 14, Holly's row. And when it did that, it shattered the window completely, causing an explosive decompression of the cabin. When even a small hole opens up in a plane flying miles above the earth, that hole will create hurricane-like forces inside of the cabin, and so anything that is not completely anchored down, including people, will get sucked out of that hole. And in this case, that's what happened. When that window broke open, Jennifer, who was sitting closest to it, was immediately sucked through the window. Now, she was not completely ejected because her seatbelt kept her from going completely out the window, but her entire upper half was now wedged outside of the plane. As for the girl sitting next to Jennifer, in between Jennifer and Holly, she was still getting pulled towards the window because Jennifer, even though she had been pulled out, there was still segments of the window that were open. And so there was still suction towards the window. And so Holly instinctively reached over and grabbed this girl and pulled her in tight to her chest. And then with her left arm, she reached behind the girl and grabbed the belt of Jennifer. And she tried to pull Jennifer back into the plane, but she could tell there was no way she could pull her back. The forces pulling Jennifer out of the plane were far too strong. Holly remembers thinking, someone is going to know this is happening. There's got to be a sensor or something. The flight crew has got to be aware that a person is getting pulled out of the plane. But in reality, the captain and the flight crew, they were aware that the left engine had blown up. That was the thing they were actively trying to combat, to try to keep the plane from crashing. But they had no idea about the drama that was unfolding, that the left engine had blown up. That was the thing they were actively trying to combat, to try to keep the plane from crashing. But they had no idea about the drama that was unfolding in row 14. And so Holly is holding on to Jennifer, she's holding on to this girl, and she's screaming out for anybody in the plane to please take notice of the fact that Jennifer is stuck out of the plane. But the sound that was being created by this open window was deafening. Nobody could hear anybody else in this plane. Not to mention, the plane is banking hard to the left, and everybody on board believes they're about to die. So no one is looking around, taking stock of what's going on and assessing what to do next. Everybody's in survival mode and is basically just focused on themselves. And so despite Holly yelling out and trying to wave to people, it was worthless. Jennifer was just stuck out the window and no help was coming. And so for several minutes, Holly is just holding on to Jennifer. She's holding on to this girl. She's screaming out for help, but no one's hearing her. And then eventually, as the plane began to come back from its bank, and it seemed like the pilot was taking control of the craft, even though it was deafening inside and it was still terrifying, people began to open up their blinders a little bit and they started to look around, and some people sitting in the vicinity of row 14, they noticed what was going on with Jennifer and they began yelling and waving for the flight attendants. But again, the sound from this window was deafening. There was just no way the attendants could hear them. And even though everyone's waving at the attendants are very preoccupied. They're dealing with the people right in front of them who are all very worried and concerned. They're trying to talk to the captain about what they need to do next. And so they did not see there was this emergency happening. And so for several more minutes, Jennifer is just stuck out the window with nobody helping her. And it was during this time, as Holly is holding on to her waist and she's holding on to the girl, that Holly is thinking, you know, Jennifer, she's been stuck outside the plane where there's no oxygen for almost 10 minutes. Nobody can survive that. And Jennifer has been forced through this window that's not big enough to have a person fit through it. And so Holly found herself moving her left hand that was gripping on to Jennifer's waist. She just let go of it, not because she was trying to let go of Jennifer. Frankly, her hand was not keeping Jennifer from going anywhere. It was just kind of habitual that she was holding on to her waist. So she takes her hand off of her waist and she just places it right in the center of Jennifer's back. Like she was comforting Jennifer. She was showing Jennifer that you're not alone. We can't help you, but you're not alone. And the woman in row 15, an older woman, she saw Holly do this, and she reached across and she put her hand on Holly's back. It was like everybody knew this is a total crisis, but there's just nothing we can do, even if it's killing Jennifer. Despite the damage to the left engine from it exploding, the captain, Tammy Jo Schultz, who was a longtime veteran of the airline, she was able to combat this hard bank to the left, and she regained control of the plane, at which point, through the intercom, she was able to bark out orders that were loud enough for the flight attendants to actually hear what was going on, and they were instructed to get up and walk down the aisles and make sure the passengers are okay. And this is when the crew spotted Jennifer. They acted quickly and rushed over and they grabbed Holly and the girl next to her, and they safely got them out of that row and moved them to a different row. And then once they were gone, two men named Andrew and Tim, they volunteered to go in row 14 and pull Jennifer back into the plane. They knew the risks. They pull her in, there is still an opening in this plane, and they could very easily just get sucked out themselves. But they didn't care. They knew they needed to help this woman. And so without any hesitation, the two men walked into row 14, they got in position, and with all their might, they were able to pull Jennifer in, they got her into the aisle, and then the two men were able to leave row 14 without being sucked out. And so Jennifer is laying in the aisle, and a passenger who happened to be a nurse, who was named Peggy, she rushed over and she began performing CPR. At this point, Holly remembers looking around the cabin and seeing that everybody was just perfectly still. It was still deafeningly loud inside of the cabin because this window is still sucking air out. So it's very, very loud, but she's looking out and there was just this aura of calm inside the plane. No one was running around, no one was panicking. Everyone was just kind of sitting, watching as Peggy was trying to save Jennifer's life. At 11:21 a.m., so 17 minutes after that pop was heard outside of the plane, the captain of this plane is able to successfully perform an emergency landing at an airport in Philadelphia. And as soon as they touched down on the runway, the captain had already coordinated with a medical team who was standing by, and they rushed on, they grabbed Jennifer, they rushed her out, they got her to the hospital, but unfortunately she didn't make it. She died from blunt force trauma from having been forced out of that window. It was just too small, and it happened too suddenly, and it killed her. Holly was obviously she didn't make it. She died from blunt force trauma. From having been forced out of that window. It was just too small, and it happened too suddenly, and it killed her. Holly was obviously very shaken up by this experience, just like the rest of the passengers who were on board. But there's a detail in Holly's story that makes her experience even more traumatic. On the morning she got on this plane, she arrived at the airport fairly early, she had a big coffee with her, and she got in line for security. So as she's going through this line, she's drinking this huge coffee, and then when it's her turn to actually go through the scanners, she finishes this coffee, she throws it away, she goes through security, and by the time she's on the other side, she's now late. And so she runs all the way to her gate, and when she boards, her boarding group has already gotten on. And so all the seats that she liked to take, those are already gone. She liked to sit towards the front of the plane because she liked to be one of the people that got off the plane first once they landed. And so she began looking for the first open row that she could sit in. And so she starts walking down the row and she finally gets to row 14. She's looking on her left and there's a totally open row, 3 open seats. And so like she always did on long flights, she took the window seat, seat 14A, because she could lean her head up against the side of the plane and sleep. And so after she buckled herself in and put her luggage underneath the seat in front of her, she remembered she had just drank that huge cup of coffee while she was going through security. And even though she didn't have to go to the bathroom right then, she expected to probably have to go a couple of times once they took off. And so not wanting to disrupt the 2 people that were inevitably going to take the 2 seats next to her by constantly all flight long getting up and sneaking past them to go to the bathroom over and over again, Holly decides, you know what, I'll just move, I will sit in the aisle seat. It's not as good because I can't sleep, but at least this way I can get up and use the bathroom without disrupting the people I'm sitting near. And so she unbuckles herself, she reaches down down, she grabs her bag from underneath the chair in front of her. She stands up and she moves 2 seats over to the aisle seat of row 14. She sits down, she puts her seatbelt on, she puts her luggage under the seat in front of her there, and then as she's kind of getting herself situated, she sees someone has stopped right outside of row 14. And so she turns, and looking down at her is the smiling face of Jennifer Reardon. And she says, "Hi, is anybody sitting next to you? Can I sit next to you?" And Holly says, "Absolutely." And Jennifer sneaks past her and sits in the window seat. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button to hold your easily...
מהדורת חורף מתנובל.
כן, נודר, אני לא בזה, אני הולך עכשיו לישון, אין לי כוח. על מי אתה מדבר?
If you suffer from claustrophobia, this is probably not a good video for you. Today, we're going to find out if you're claustrophobic. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious,
זה? אתה מדבר עליו כאילו? זה מצחיק.
stories. "33-year-old Nicola Raybon was a nurse who also studied criminology in college. In January of 2012, she..."
אתה מדבר עליי או עליו? שפרצוף ששלח פיצה. הוא, נכון? אם זהו, כן, כן. אני לא...
She was thrilled to move into a new house in Lancashire with her partner John and her 2 kids. And then later that month, she and her family flew out to the Caribbean island of Antigua to attend her father's second marriage. And while she was excited for her father, she was mostly just excited about the...
אם אתה לא מכיר אותו, הוא בן אדם שמספר סיפורים כאילו שמבוססים על סיפור אמיתי, וזה דווקא די מעניין כאילו, כי זה מפחיד, אני יודע מה, זה מסתורי. אז מה אתה רוצה לראות, אחי? משחקים אני לא הולך לראות. כרגע משחקים אני לא הולך לראות, אחי.
pampering she was going to get from the 5-star hotel she was staying in. On the first...
נתת לייק, תדע יגבר. אני מקשיב לסיפורים כי זה... במיוחד שלא, כי זה עוזר לי לישון. למרות שזה סוג של אימה או משהו כזה.
First night they arrived, Nicola went down to the bar to have a couple drinks with her friends. Now, Nicola was not known for being a big drinker or partier. In fact, she was more well known for her work with different charities and for being a really dedicated mother. In fact, one time, after her children were named mascots for a local soccer team, Nicola apparently lost sleep. She was so excited for them. After Nicola had a few drinks, her friends said they were going to leave and go to a restaurant to grab some dinner, and they asked her if she wanted to come. And Nicola declined, and she said, "You know what? I'd rather just go watch the sunset up on the beach. You guys have a good time." After her friends left, Nicola walked up the steps onto the beach. She took her sandals off and took her phone out of her pocket, and she put them on a chair, and she walked off. Later that night, Nicola's father was supposed to meet up with his daughter, but when he went to their meeting spot, she didn't show up. And so he walked around the hotel asking different guests if they'd seen her, and no one seemed to know where she was, but that group of friends that had sat with her at the bar, he found them, and they said, "Oh yeah, she went on the beach to watch the sunset." And so Nicola's father actually smiled to himself because he thought, great, I can go on the beach, find my daughter and finally have a chance to have, a one-on-one conversation with her, because ever since I got to Antigua, I've been surrounded by guests and I barely had a chance to talk to her. And so Nicola's father walks up to the beach and he looks around and he doesn't see his daughter, and it's starting to get dark, so he figures, you know what, I'll give her a call. And so he calls his daughter and she doesn't pick up. And he thinks, okay, she probably just isn't looking at her phone. After that, he called Nicola's partner, John, and he picked up and he said, no, I haven't seen her. The last I heard, I thought she was going to the beach. That's what her friend said. And Nicola's father said, yeah, that's where I am and I can't find her, but I'm sure she's somewhere. And so after he hung up with John, Nicola's father went back into the hotel and he asked Nicola's kids if they had seen her, and they said no. And so now, feeling a little bit concerned, Nicola's father rounds up a couple of guests to go help him look for his daughter. And so they go up on the beach, and one of them quickly discovers Nicola's cell phone and sandals sitting on that chair near the hotel. And so right away, it just seems like this is a big red flag. She's out on the beach. We don't know where she is. She doesn't have her phone. And so now Nicola's father is really worried and he calls the police. Then at some point, as the search party moved farther and farther down the beach, they heard the sound of someone screaming in the distance. And it sounded like a woman, and Nicola's father said it sounded like his daughter. And so they all start running in the direction of the screaming, but it's so far away and it's so dark that they can't make out who it is or even where they are. And after they ran down the beach a ways, the screaming just stopped. And so they really couldn't figure out who it was. And so everyone's just stumped and overwhelmed by the situation. And for the rest of the night, they just continued to look around the beach, and they never found the screaming woman, and they never found Nicola. The next morning, when the police were still on the beach looking for Nicola and now looking in the hotel as well, the tide went out, and that's when they discovered Nicola. After she left the bar, Nicola did go up onto the beach to watch the sunset, and she did it by going down to the water and just walking along the water's edge. And so as she walked away from the resort, watching this beautiful sunset, she walked deeper and deeper into the water until she was almost waist deep. And at some point, she hit a patch of quicksand and sunk into it. And so she began screaming and yelling for help, but no one could hear her because she was so far away from the resort. And so for hours, she sat there as the tide slowly came in, and she was just pinned, waiting to drown. And then finally, when people realized she was missing and that search party was within earshot of her, it was too late. The water levels were already at her neck, and by the time they actually got up pretty close to her, the water had gone over her head and she drowned. It turned out the search party was basically right next to her, but by the time they got there, she was already underwater, so they couldn't see her. Growing up in Oklahoma, Blake Stanfield loved going out in the wilderness with his father, Neil. The pair were more like best friends than father and son, and they spent as much time together as they possibly could. But by the time Blake was in his 30s, he had become a medical doctor, and so he was really busy, and he was married, and he had a young kid, and so he didn't see his father very much. And then in 2003, when Blake was 38, he moved his family to Alaska, and so he really didn't see his father anymore. But shortly after moving, Blake had an idea. He wanted to surprise his dad on his 65th birthday with a rafting trip in Alaska. It was going to be this great way for the two to reconnect with each other. When he broke the news to his father, Neil was really touched by it and very excited, but at the same time, he was a little bit apprehensive, and he asked his son, are we going in a group? Is this going to be a guided rafting trip? And Blake said, oh no, that's the wrong way to do this. We will not have a good time if we go with a group. We're doing this alone. And so Neil said, well, isn't that a little bit risky, just the two of us out in the middle of Alaska? And Blake said, don't worry, I've picked a river that by Alaskan standards is considered leisurely, so we'll be just fine. Neil was still hesitant about it, but the two of them were very competent outdoorsmen, and so ultimately he just went along with it. So later that year, in early July, Blake and Neil took a float plane out to the gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska. This park is totally beautiful, but it's also very dangerous because it's full of grizzly bears and wolves, and it's also very remote. There's no people anywhere near this park. It's basically untouched wilderness. Adding to the isolation and danger, Blake and Neil did not have their cell phones or a radio. It was Blake's idea. He said it would be a good idea for us to just totally disconnect and just spend quality time together. And then also Blake had chosen a starting point on this river that was situated basically right in the middle of the park, which meant it was 60 miles away from the nearest human settlement. So after they got dropped off by this float plane and then the captain of that plane took off again, Blake and Neil loaded their stuff into their raft and then they hopped in and they started cruising down this river. At first, their trip was awesome. The weather was perfect, the landscape was beautiful, the water was totally calm, and Neil, he might have had reservations about the safety of this trip, but quickly he was overcome with just how peaceful it was and how wonderful it was to be with just his son out on the open water. And in fact, Blake had intentionally booked this trip 2 weeks before the start of the official rafting season in Alaska, which meant really there was nobody else in the water. It was just those two. And they thought, wow, what luck. Except it turns out there's a very specific reason why the rafting season starts when it does in Alaska, because that's the earliest the ice melts in the river and it becomes safe to travel on. After 2 hours of peace and tranquility out on this river, Blake and Neil started to notice these large ice chunks in the water ahead of them. And they were easy enough to get around, but as they kept moving, the current was picking up and these ice chunks got bigger and bigger until they started being these huge sheets all across the edges of the river where there was only a narrow strip of water they could travel through. And at some point, Neil asked Blake if it would be a good idea to just pull the raft over to the side of the river and get out and reassess the situation and see if we've reached an anomaly in the river where just this section is frozen, or if this is going to continue for a lot farther, and if so, we need to make alternative plans here. But Blake was not having it. He was stubborn, he wanted to keep going, and he was convinced he could maneuver the boat around the ice. And he said, let's just keep going a little bit farther. And so when they went a little bit farther, they reached a point where the current was so strong that they could no longer get out of the river. They had to ride it like a rapid until it stopped. And so as the father and son are fighting with each other about not having gotten out of the river while they still had a chance, they were not paying attention to what was in front of them, and they came around a corner and there was this huge ice shelf that was right across the whole river that basically blocked the whole path. And they turned at the last second. They couldn't do anything either way, but the nose of the raft went directly under the ice shelf and it flipped the raft onto its side, dumping Neil and Blake into frigid Alaskan waters underneath the ice shelf. And Blake would later say that he really believed that this was it. He didn't know how far this ice shelf was going to go on for, and so he assumed, I'm about to drown. But they managed to hit this air pocket inside of this ice shelf. The ice basically formed up at a bow, and they both happened to pop up into it, and they gripped onto the ice. And they're looking at each other, and they have no idea how long this ice shelf continues, but the current is pulling them, and they know it's just a matter of time before they get sucked under and go back under the ice. And so they look at each other, and they don't really know what to say, but it's kind of obvious that they think they're about to drown. And then at some point, Neil gets sucked under and swept away, and then Blake follows shortly after. And unfortunately, they only tumbled along for about 10 or 15 more feet before they popped up again. But much like the boat that could not paddle out of the river because of how strong the current was, Blake and Neil could not get out of the river in time before they hit yet another ice shelf. And the next ice shelf was much longer than the first. And so they knew it was going to happen. They grabbed onto the ice shelf and they're holding on and they're trying to pull themselves back out, but the current's too strong. And at some point, they each had to take a big breath and then let go and got pulled directly under the ice. And so the whole time they're pressing their face up against the underside of this ice in hopes they find an air pocket, but they don't. And so the whole time they're just desperately looking for air and they're bumping into the underside of the ice. They have no idea how long it's going to go on for. And so after what felt like an eternity, Blake finally gets shot out the backside of this huge ice shelf. And he's still in the river, but there's no more ice shelves in front of him, and the current had slowed down a little bit, so he was able to make his way to the edge and get out of the water. And he turned to face the water, and his dad was nowhere to be found. And so Blake turns, and he doesn't see his father coming out of the ice. He doesn't know if he's still under, if he came out again. And so he turns and runs downstream in hopes that he might have come out already. And sure enough, he found his dad clutching a rock in the middle of this river farther up. His head was badly bleeding, but he was alive. And so Blake grabbed a stick and was able to bring his father back into shore. Even though they had survived being pulled under the ice, they now had no equipment, no gear, no food, no water, no anything, because it was pulled under the water, and they were soaking wet and becoming hypothermic, and they're in the middle of nowhere with no one nearby to help them, and no one's expecting them for a week, and no planes are going to be in the area for 2 weeks. Fortunately, Blake had a lighter in his pocket that worked, and so they were able to start a fire and stay warm, and they were able to scare away grizzly bears and wolves. Blake finally walked away from their campsite, which was up on a mountain, and he went down to this river where he was able to flag down a float plane that was not even scheduled to be in the area. It was just totally random, and they saw Blake, they came back, they picked him up, and both men were just fine. They did say that even though the trip was a complete disaster and nearly killed both of them, it did reconnect them in a way that few things could, and their relationship is good as ever. But they both say they will never go rafting again. On July 10th, 1941, a brand new British submarine was commissioned called HMS Umpire. 9 days later, on July 19th, the submarine and her crew were told to meet up with a convoy moving north along the Medway River in England and make their way to Scotland. So Umpire joined up with the convoy, but then they started having engine problems that night, and they began drifting back behind the convoy until they were basically not in the convoy anymore at all. During this time, the commander of the submarine was up in the bridge, which is the area that controls the submarine when it's above surface, just above the wing. The captain of the Umpire was concerned this convoy would not see them when they came through because they were a submarine, so they're sitting low in the water and they're already all dark. They have no lights on the outside on purpose because this was during World War II and they didn't want German ships or planes to spot them. And because of their engine problems, they had drifted away from their convoy, which would have been protection. So the captain decides to deviate from their course to get the submarine clearly out of the way of this convoy. And so when he started turning the submarine, the steering broke, leaving the submarine now turned so its entire side is now facing this convoy, and they were still drifting directly towards this convoy. And so sure enough, before the captain could do anything, one of the larger ships struck the side of the submarine, immediately flooding their forward torpedo room. And for a brief second, the submarine and the ship were kind of mangled together, and then it slipped off the ship and it sunk all the way to the bottom, 18 meters down. The captain, along with the other 3 men that were up on the bridge with him when they were struck, they managed to leap out at the last second and were treading water when this all happened. As for the other 34 crew members, they were stuck inside when it sunk. A number of the crew had been sleeping at the time of the crash, and so all they felt was this crash, the power goes out, they leap out of their beds, and they're landing in waist-deep water, and they're running out into the halls kind of fumbling around because they can't see anything, and all they can hear is the sound of water pouring inside of their submarine. And so these sailors had gone through all sorts of drills to prepare for this type of scenario where, power's out and you're sinking, and so they know by touch how to get to the one area that has an escape hatch, which is the engine room. And after 20 of them got inside the engine room, the water levels in the hallway were getting so high that it was spilling into that room, and it was getting to the point where if they didn't seal the door, they were going to flood this one room that was their only chance of survival. And so they had to make the heartbreaking decision to lock and seal that door, meaning the 14 other sailors on the other side, if they hadn't already died, were now condemned. But for the 20 men who now were going to be able to use this escape hatch, there was no guarantee that would work. Because to use the escape hatch on a submarine, you need to understand how it works. You can't just open a hatch on a submarine. It won't open. The pressure from the seawater presses down on it to where it literally cannot open. You might be able to open it a crack if you use a tool, but that's about it. In order to open the escape hatch, you need to use something called a lockout chamber. And so a lockout chamber is like this really tight claustrophobia-inducing thing that looks an awful lot like a gas chamber, where you step through one hatch and you shut it and you seal it so it's watertight, and then above you is your escape hatch. But you can't open it until the pressure inside of the chamber has been equalized. And the way they do that is they flood the inside of the chamber the escapee is in. And so you're standing inside of this tight space, totally sealed in, and there's a control panel inside the chamber itself and also inside the sub, if you're lucky enough to have someone do that for you. You turn on the chamber, at which point water is dumped inside of this tight space you're in until it's completely full and you're holding your breath, at which point you've now equalized. The pressure inside the chamber is equal to that outside, and you can actually open the hatch. So the person inside on a breath hold undoes the hatch, opens it up, and then hopefully your swim isn't too far because you're already on a breath hold, and you swim to the surface. And during World War II, submariners were outfitted with a special piece of equipment if they ever needed to leave via the escape hatch, and it was their Davis escape gear, which is basically this life jacket that's uninflated, and when you manually activate it, it suddenly inflates, and so when you go through that hatch, you would activate it, and it would assist you to get to the surface. And so after those 20 sailors had decided to seal off the engine room, they immediately shifted focus and began getting guys into the escape hatch. And one of their most junior sailors, a guy by the name of Killian, said he would stay inside the room and operate the control panel so everybody else had the best chance of getting out of the escape hatch. And so sure enough, he put all 19 into the hatch and he got them out of the submarine. And then he, on his own, had to get in the hatch, seal it himself, and control the panel in total darkness, flood the space, open it up, and shoot to the surface. He would live, and he would be awarded the British Empire Medal for bravery. One junior officer named Edward Jones was one of the 14 men that did not get to the engine room before they sealed it off. And when he got there and realized the situation, he turned around and looked down the hall, and there were only 3 other men that were standing there. And he didn't know how many had made it in the engine room. He figured this was the only 4 that had not made the cut. But in fact, there was actually 10 other people that were just stuck in various places inside of the submarine. But Jones decided he only had these guys in front of him, and so he said, hey, come with me, I have an idea. As Jones led them down this hallway, the water levels had risen up to their necks, and all these circuits on the walls were starting to spark all around them. And so Jones led them to the middle of the submarine, and then he turned and went up into the control room. And then from the control room, he went even farther up into what's called the conning tower. The conning tower is a submarine's main attack center. It's where you have those periscopes they look around in, and it also has the firing buttons for their torpedoes. It is not designed to be an escape hatch, because once you flood the conning tower, there's no control panel like there is on an escape hatch to drain the water that was used to equalize in order to open the hatch. So once the water's in, it's either you get to the surface or you drown. Also, in order to exit out of the conning tower, you need to go through this very narrow tube that goes straight up, and it's got a ladder through it that can barely fit 1 person climbing up, meaning the people at the bottom of the ladder will have to hold their breath a lot longer than the people at the top. So Jones and the other 3 sailors, they get to the conning tower and they seal the hatch at their feet, so blocking the hallway flood from coming into where they are. And they realize that even though they have to do this, there are no other alternatives here, that realistically 1 or 2 or more are going to die in the process of just trying to get out of the submarine. But it was all they could do, so they made peace with their decision. They climbed up and they opened the hatch just enough to let water come in, but quite a bit started coming in. The men wedged themselves as high up in the tunnel as they possibly could, but obviously not everybody could get all the way up to the hatch. And so 2 were down low, and Edward Jones and 1 other were up towards the top. And Jones would say that at first they were talking and praying, and then when they started feeling the water get closer and closer to their heads, they went silent. And then Jones remembers keeping his hand on the 1 man that was below him, and when his hand was wet, he knew the 2 men below him were completely submerged. And then the water came up to his face, covered his head, and at that point he opened it up and they swam out. Of the 4 men in the conning tower, only Edward Jones and the other guy who was high up in the tunnel with him made it to the surface. All told, only 14 of the 38 total crew survived the accident. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button to deepen the defensive trench around OP Rock. And you can tell them that in exchange for their work, they can keep any of the artifacts they dig up out of the ground. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballin. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
המוות שלו ואז מתפלא שכועסים עליו. אז למי שאיכשהו לא שמע, יוצר התוכן גוואלד זייף את ההתאבדות שלו וגרם לכל הקהל שלו, אגב 218,000 אנשים, לחשוב בלב שלם ובאמונה מלאה שהוא מת. רק כדי שאחר כך יוכל לצאת לאוויר העולם, להגיד שההתאבדות שלו הייתה מזויפת ולהטיף מוסר לכל אלה שמעזים לבקר אותו על המהלך המטומטם שהוא עשה במסווה של ניסיון לשינוי חברתי. עכשיו, יש מצב שאני הייתי קונה את ההתייפיפות המטומטמת הזאת לזה שהוא מנסה לעשות איזה שינוי בחברה שלנו, יש מצב שאני הייתי קונה את זה, אלא עם העובדה שאיזה שעה אחרי שהוא חשף שהוא לא באמת מת, הוא העלה שיר. ולשיר קוראים באופן לא מפתיע מת. וזה, אם תשאלו אותי, הטריק השיווקי הכי מזעזע, נוראי ומגעיל שראיתי בישראל או אפילו בעולם. עכשיו, לפני שאני אגיד מה העובדות בשטח ומה ההיגיון הבריא, בשם כל מי שיש לו יותר מתא מוח מתפקד אחד ומבין שלזייף את ההתאבדות שלך מכל סיבה שהיא, אלא אם אתה מתחמק מהמאפיה, זה לא משהו לגיטימי. אני חושב שלגוואלד יש מקום להגן על עצמו, אז אני אקריא לכם את כל הסטורים המצטדקים שהבן אדם העלה, בניסיון להוריד קצת אש מכל השיט סטורם המטורף שהאינפנטיל המטומטם הזה הביא על עצמו. אומרים עליי שאני בושה. איפה הייתם כשרציתי להתאבד בכל החצי שנה האחרונה? איפה? אתם יודעים משהו עליי בכלל? אתם יודעים מה עברתי? אם אני מת אז בוכים, ואם אני חי אז שונאים. אתם מבינים שזה בדיוק הסיבה שעשיתי את זה? אם זה היה תלוי בכם, הייתם מעדיפים שאני... אבל יותר אירוני שדף כמו ישראל בדיוק עם סכרת לא אומר שאתה שונה מכל האדג'לורס שמנסים באמת. אתם בדם קר ושל...
שלום לכולם, קוראים לי גיא סלנוב, זה הווידאו הראשון שלי, אני מראה לכם את מיינקראפט. אני עכשיו אראה לכם
Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the floor. Let the bodies hit the
מישהו יכול להסביר לי את הבדיחה בדיסקריפשן? לא יודע. אני באר שבע שואל, מה זה ג'ף? אנחנו באמת צריכים לעבור את כל זה עוד פעם? מתן שואל, איך עושים שריפה חזקה לחברים שלך לשכבה? אוקיי, סטורי טיים. אז מתן הנחמד הזה שכתב את זה, הוא לומד איתי. ואני לא יודע איך או למה, אבל כל המפץ הגדול, כל האנרגיה של המפץ הגדול, איכשהו נמצאת בכף היד שלו. אני לא בטוח איך, אבל כל פעם שהיד שלו יוצרת איזה סוג של מגע עם הגב שלך, אתה עף לפחות 15 טריליארד קילומטרים אחורה, ואתה גם מת. אני לא יודע איך הוא עושה את זה, אז הוא שאל את זה שאלה רטורית. You fucking pranked me. מלגרן מעמיק שואל, היית אומר אני חייל של מלגרן כחול? טכנית כאילו הייתי אומר את זה, אבל כרגע אמרתי את זה, אז אם אני אגיד זה עוד פעם עכשיו זה לא יהיה כל כך נחשב. גם אתה מתחת אותי, וואו, אני לא טוב היום. דולב שיטי שואל, איך מנגנים על הבסון? נגינה על הבסון? יואב רור... The fuck? יואב רור? יואב? הכל בסדר? יואב שואל, מה דעתך על ניסויים בבעלי חיים? זה כמו הומוסקסואליות, זה לא בסדר. תירשמו לזייג ונרופ שואלת, אתה מוכן להסביר לעולם למה זייג ונרופ זה ערוץ כל כך שפל, מגעיל וגרוע, מגיע לעם לדעת? טוב, אני בעצם חושב שזייג ונרופ הוא למעשה כאילו כל המקור לכל הבעיות בעולם. אני גם די בטוח שהוא בעצמו היטלר, ובשלב מסוים הוא פשוט ימחק את כל האנושות בעזרת פצצות אטום, והוא פשוט צריך להתעלות ולהישרף כמה שיותר מהר? נראה לי, זה הגיוני? לא יודע, אוקיי, אני רק אומר... שלא תראו אותם יותר בחיים. מן הסתם
בסרטון של היום אתגרתי יוטיובר באתגר שהוא החלום של כל אחד. פרטיזן קיבל אתגר שכל הרגע שהוא עושה בוולורנט ברנק איירון, שזה הכי נמוך שיש, הוא מקבל 100 שקל. אבל מה שהוא לא יודע זה שהאתגר הוא בעצם משהו שונה לגמרי. אני הולך לשלם לו 100 שקל על כל פעם שהוא בכלל מת. לא! ואם הוא הורג מישהו אז יורד לו 20 שקל. אל תדלגו על שום חלק בסרטון כי אתם לא רוצים לפספס אף רגע. חבר'ה, השעה עכשיו 7:40. אני כבר במשך שבוע בודק מתי פרטיזן עולה ללייב, ואני ידעתי מראש בערך בשעה 7 ומשהו פרטיזן בדרך כלל עולה ללייב. אני הזמנתי את האנשים היפים האלה כאן, ומה שהוא לא יודע זה שאנחנו הולכים עכשיו לבוא אליו הביתה בזמן שהוא בלייב ולאתגר אותו באתגר של החלומות שלו. יאללה, בוא נצא. אתם יודעים שאני לא באמת יודע לאן אני נוסע.
מה זה לא יודע לאן אתה נוסע? לפרטיזן, אחי.
לפרטיזן, אבל אתה חושב שאני זוכר מה הכתובת שלו? באתי להגיד, מה זה שלו? כן, כתובת אומרים, איזה מטומטם אני. מה יש לי, אחי?
טוב, מה שקורה פה זה ככה. תמיד אני אומר לפרטיזן שאני בא אליו, אבל אמרתי אם עכשיו אני גם ככה בא אליו בגלל שהחרא הזה סינג'ר אותי, הפעם אני אעשה לו ככה בהפוכה. אז נכנסתי ללייב שלו. טוב, עכשיו אני שולח לו שאני בא.
עכשיו אני בא? בסדר. שאת כמה אמין שזון יבוא? יש לו נסיעה אליי, פלוס מינוס שעה וחצי, שעה 40. כמה אמין שהבן אדם יבוא? הוא לא אמין בכלל.
Are you sure about that?
מה, אתה רציני?
לא אמין בכלל.
Are you sure about that?
גם אני גר בפתח תקווה. איזה מוזר זה לראות סרטונים את המקום שאתה גר בו?
טוב, הגענו ליעד. אם להגיד לכם את האמת, אני יודע שהוא גר איפשהו פה באזור, אני לא בטוח איפה.
ליד גלגדות, לא בוא נלך לגלגדות.
אחי, לא למדת מהסרטון של דילן שלו. אז וואו! טוב, אני מזכיר לכם, כל קיל שהוא עושה הוא חושב שהוא הולך להרוויח 100 שקל, בפועל זה כשהוא מת הוא מקבל 100 שקל, כשהוא הורג הוא מפסיד כסף, לא לזרוק לו שום רמז, שום דבר, אל תעזור לו גם יותר מדי פעמים למות.
למה לא? למה לא?
אני כאן כדי לחזור.
ראיתי זה, אבל רציתי לראות את זה גם בלייב.
Spare some change. Sure.
ברוכים הבאים לעוד יום של טירוף. והיום אני השתלטתי על אולם קולנוע שלם למשך 24 שעות. תפסנו את...
Yo, what's going on YouTube, man? It's the kid, Baby Rich, back for another video. I don't know what you're thinking. Why am I in the bath?
Get that PK, please, bro. Oh my lord. You're flying for what?
Yeah, that was
No way, bro. I'm time to chase this guy. We gotta go. We gotta go. We gotta not go there.
הצליח ללכת כאילו לעלות על הזיפליין כל כך מהר.
God, they're going crazy in there. Oh, this is what we're doing.
It's a movement. Wow.
No. Oh my god, I mantled a death match, bro.
Nice.
You're in their sights.
Oh, this is very dank, dude.
Need to recharge my shields. Half the squads are gone.
I can't see shit. Oh my smokes.
Need to recharge my shields.
Oh my god, guy's not dead.
Need to recharge my shields.
He was a wee bit lost.
Look out. Throwing thermite grenade.
Here's the play, boys. We need to kill the Pathfinder right now. Wait, they didn't res this. They're trolling. Alright, here's the play. We're gonna swing up the zip like a madman. Oh lord. No, he didn't get down by that. I'm mauling. No! I L'd. I just L'd so hard.
Recharging my shields.
Oh my god, dude.
לילה